Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the San Benito County Board of Supervisors regular meeting for September 23rd, 2014. If you'll rise with me, we'll be led in the Pledge of Allegiance by Supervisor Rivas.
Ready, salute. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Would it entertain a motion to acknowledge the certificate of posting?
So moved.
Second, Mr. Chair.
A motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Passes 5-0. We'll move on to public comment. This is an opportunity to address the board on any item of interest not appearing on the agenda. No action may be taken unless otherwise provided by Government Code Section 54954-2. Do we have any speaker cards?
Yes, we do. Whitney Pintello?
Good morning, Chairman Munzer and esteemed supervisors. My name is Whitney Pintello. I'm from Gilroy. I'm the new executive director for the San Benito Olive Festival. As you might know, we're a nonprofit organization, and we've been warmly welcomed by San Benito County, and we're about to host our second annual Olive Festival at Bellado Park, October 11th. We'd like to join all of you. We'd like to invite all of you to join us. It's a celebration of our wonderful county and its wonderful agriculture. And we'd like to thank you all for welcoming us and making it possible.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yes.
She's going to hand you out a pretty picture on fracking, and I won't say anything else about fracking until after Bowler and Marshall have their comments. But then some questions that we'll have there. Hey, there's some money in Measure J, hotly contested. Some of you are for it, some of you are against it, whichever case may be. One of the unintended consequences if Measure J passes and Measure P down in Santa Barbara, and the one that'll come up in Butte County in 2014, all written by the same law firm, very, very similar. Unintended consequences if these things pass. Get out your Constitution, your copy of the Constitution, and check the Fifth Amendment on condemnation. When you pass this, assuming it passes, and you modify your general plan to include the requirements that the Measure J has, you will have, in effect, inverse condemnation of personal property, private property assets. You can expect some lawsuits on that, and they won't go away. Just like a couple of weeks ago, the ghost of the Los Valiantes were floating around in your committees. But if you get this Measure J passed and get this inverse condemnation in there, you can expect some lawsuits that will be rather large. They will last a long time, and when you're considering next year's budget, you better start putting some reserves in there for it, because it's going to be some big numbers. Thank you.
Okay, would anyone else like to address the board at this time on any item not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to the department heads. Mr. Espinoza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we do have a few announcements. One is on September the 16th, 2014, the Sheriff's Office with the Administration Office sent the funding request for supplemental court security funding pursuant to Government Code Section 69927, and we requested $480,500 to supplement the court security that we have for that building across the street. So I wanted to make sure the board and the public was aware of that we went ahead and submitted that to the DOF last week. In addition to that, I attended a CSAC meeting a few weeks back, and there was discussion with regards to AB 109 and what the forecast looks like for the next couple of years. It looks as though we will be receiving additional funding for AB 109. It looks like in fiscal year 2015-16, we'll be allocated over $300,000 more on that. So I just wanted to let the board know. The CCP is aware of this, as well as probation and the sheriff's office as well. So I'm sure we'll be getting a more detailed report from our CPO in the next few months, but I just want to let the board know that that was what occurred. Other than that, I have no other announcements.
All right, we'll move on to board announcements. Supervisor Rivas? Supervisor De La Cruz?
None, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Barrios?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just add to what our CAO just mentioned about the money coming from AB 109 funding into the county. We did have a CCP meeting yesterday morning, and there is discussion about data integration, which is very critical for our community. That would include sharing of information with our sheriff's department, our police department, probation department, and our DA's office. So that is a discussion that is going to hopefully shortly will come to this board to make a decision on whether we want to go in that direction with that funding. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Bertello?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, Supervisor Barrios and I, along with our staff, our county council, our CAO, met with the courts to work on some issues that we have out there. We are going to continue those meetings and resolve some of the issues that we have, between the county and the state courts for public defense. But we appreciate the time that, the judges have set aside and their willingness to work with us resolve some of our issues. The second thing, along with you, Mr. Chairman, COG, we had a meeting last week, might have been 2 weeks. Anyhow, time flies. We continue to discuss Highway 25 and how the appropriate procedures could be done to place that on the constraint list. The discussion is what the design of the project needs to be so it's affordable for this the community, as well as the funding. A lot of discussions, and that's be an ongoing process, as you know, Mr. Chairman. And we'll certainly keep the rest of the board informed as we move along with the process. But it takes some time. Thank you.
Thank you. That project is definitely going to take some time, but I think everybody's committed to getting Highway 25 back on the constraint list. I'd also like to report that the Board of Directors for the Monterey Bay Unified Air Pollution Control District met on Wednesday, September 17th, and they awarded San Benito County $106,000 in AB 2766 grants. And those grants were broken down by San Benito COG received $25,000 to go towards the purchase of a new van for their van pool project. The San Benito County Probation Department received $27,000 to go towards a new Chevy Spark. Hollister Municipal Airport received $17,000 to go towards a John Deere quad. And the San Benito County Sheriff's Department received $37,000 to go towards electric motorcycles and other vehicles. So I'm just proud to be part of the Air District and bring that money to our county. With that, we will move on to the consent items, consent agenda. I've been asked to pull item 8, 12, 13, and 14. And number 11. Would, members of the board, is there any other item that you would like pulled? Seeing none. Any other item from any member of the public would like to see pulled from the consent item? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the board?
So move, Mr. Chair, for amended consent.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Passes 5-0. We'll move on to item number 8. Mr. Espinoza?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we have our Health and Human Services Director, Jim Writing Sword, here to answer any questions your board may have.
Morning.
Morning.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I'm the one who requested this one to move out. Jim, I got just a couple of quick questions. How was the selection done to bring in this group to do the grant writing opportunities?
We basically went out and looked for people in the local community that had experience and background in this, and we're bringing this to you as a contract. They have formed themselves into an LLC.
And I guess here's the bottom line question is that we're paying someone, I'm kind of confused because at sections it has $8,000, $8,700, another one there's $87,000 contract. And typically when we bring in grant writers, there's a, if you succeed in a grant, you can write, your part of the G&A in the grant instead of actually paying out at front. So what's the difference between other grant writers who will say, okay, I will write a grant, and if I succeed, I will get paid for that grant, whereas this is a guaranteed payout, irregardless if they succeed in getting grants or not?
Well, actually, they get paid, based upon the grants that are assigned to them, so they're only paid, when they're working. In the future, if we can put together grants that will include that kind of funding in it, that's what we would do. What we really wanted to try to do here was build a local expertise, local group that knows our community and can help us with that, and we have that with this group.
Okay. And this is a non-general fund
Yes, it is.
activity? Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Anybody else on the board like to? None? Anyone from the public like to address this item? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the board?
Motion to approve item number 8, Mr. Chair.
A motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Passes 5-0. Move on to item number 11. Mr. Espinoza?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we have Mandy Rose, our Director of Integrated Waste, here to answer any questions either the public or you have, your board.
Speaker is Marty Richmond.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Marty Richmond from Hollister. I'd like to repeat the comments I made at the City Council on a similar extension last night. I have no objection to the extension, but during the time of this contract extension and probably immediately after, we are going to be required by the state to change the way we collect our trash and dispose of it. And you may wind up with several more sorting cans, sort things you have to do because they're going to ban organic waste, is my understanding, from the landfill altogether, and make other changes. And those changes may involve a lot of expense for the public. And they're not built into this contract extension yet because they're not here yet. But that would be a good place to put the money that you've gotten back from the closure fund, since that was involved in the landfill and was paid by the public on the idea that it was going to be used to closed as a closing fund. But you found other public lands to essentially contract away for out-of-county trash to pay for the closing, and you're going to get that money back. The best place to use it would be to implement this upcoming changes to the requirement for landfill and disposal, and to keep that extra cost off the back of the taxpayers. Thank you for your time.
Are there any questions of the member of the board on this item? Supervisor Patello?
Yeah, well, maybe Mandy, can you elaborate on, if there be some changes in the collection of waste, how it would be incorporated in our agreement with the pick up?
Sure. Excuse me, sure. Let me just start by saying good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I think we talked about this briefly the last time we were here. So what we're anticipating is, this is again based on greenhouse gas emissions and mandates that are coming down from the state, that we may be required within this is an estimate, 3 to 5 year time frame when they ban organics from the landfill. At this time, as a regional agency, the county and the 2 cities do not mandate the pickup of green waste or food waste. So if and when that happens, which obviously we anticipate it will because that's the way things seem to be going, we would, if it happened within this 3-year period, we would have to come back and negotiate an amendment to the contract. If it happened subsequent to that time, it would obviously be part of any bid process that would go on in the future. So we have, I don't have the Ouija board to know exactly when this is going to get implemented, but if in fact that occurred, we'd have to take it at that time. I think if you currently have yard waste service and you're subscribing to that service, yes, that is an additional charge at this time. The anticipation would be combining food and yard waste together, so we would end up with 3 carts. I mean, everyone would have 3 carts now. Most people have 2.
Yeah, and, it goes without saying, I think we certainly need to comply with whatever state laws and regulations there are, and Recology is an outstanding company that does so as well, and we just cross that bridge when we get to it, that's for sure. Thank you.
Right.
Anyone else from the public like to address the board on this item? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the board?
I'll move to approve amendment number 2 with Recology.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Passes 5-0.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. We'll move on to item 12. Mr. Espinoza?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, item number 12, this is out of our planning department. We have our interim planning director, Byron Turner, here to answer any questions. We also have counsel here as well to answer any of the legal questions that may come out from the board or the public.
Speaker is Marvin Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Marvin Jones, Hollister. How many times are we going to do a supplemental environmental impact statement on this project there? It seems like it's been done before. Every time you run a developer or potential developer out of money, somebody else comes in and picks it up. And I understand now the one that there's got rather deep pockets, and he can tolerate this 115 plus or minus 10% $1,000. So just wondered how many times that we're going to do this. What does it take to have to do another one? Just curious. Thank you, Jan.
Byron, do you want to address that a little bit?
No, this is required. This is not a county requirement. This is a state requirement. This is to facilitate the PG&E upgrades that are required in order to let this continue this project forward. So if there was another environmental document to utilize for this process, we would look at it, but this is what was determined. And it should be the last part of the process.
Any questions of any of the members of the board? Any questions or comments from any member of the public on this item? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the board?
I will make a motion to approve per staff recommendation.
A second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Passes 5-0. Let's see, we will move on to item number 13. Mr. Espinoza.
Yeah, this particular item was continued from our last board meeting on 9/9/14. We have Byron Turner as well to discuss at your board this particular item or to answer any questions from the public or your board.
Jeanette Langstaff.
Thank
Thank you. I'm Jeanette Langstaff, a resident of Hollister, and I just presented this letter because I want to make sure that all these concerns are being considered when you are suggesting approval for a certain change. So this is because it does address our initiative, the initiative that's before the public, the voters, to ban well stimulation treatments and enhanced recovery throughout unincorporated areas in San Benito County and all the petroleum operations in the residential general plan designations and related zoning changes. Last week's Planning Commission meeting brought about, I put here, an upheaval to the way this election is being influenced, I think, by the petroleum industry and the attorneys. I will explain as follows, but ask you not to change our existing ordinance on record that affect our initiative. It would alter the intent and regulations of this document to protect our natural resources that the people get a chance to vote on. This seems to come from the new draft ordinance presented at Wednesday's Planning Commission meeting, and the purpose of the ordinance states a question was raised about amending the chapter. Also, a letter was hand-delivered a day before to the commission by anti-initiative opponents with statements of lots of lawsuits that will come up with the draft ordinance as is. Then before the meeting, it was changed, draft ordinance with lots of text lined out to delete it. Planning Department exceeded and lined out that text to Section 19.21, deleting the determination of exemptions. Section 2, they lined out Chapter 25.43. The purpose of the ordinance handed out explains, therefore, in abundance of caution, all amendments to Chapter 25.43 have been eliminated. So if this is referring to this approval, I'm very concerned. That's why I'm putting this forward. However, the initiative states 19.21, all actions taken under this chapter shall be consistent and in compliance with the provisions of the initiative. No use permit, modification to a use permit, or other entitlement shall be granted, extended, or enforced through action or inaction that is inconsistent. Some leaders and professionals are questioning why these amendments are being altered before the initiative has even been voted on, except for causing confusion in voting and loopholes for opponents' sake. It's a warranted decision to, I've put stop such an approval request now, but you have to decide that. Put priorities and fairness in place for the residents and not waste valuable time and money. At Wednesday's meeting, we were told that this draft ordinance copies that which is being done in Santa Barbara, as our initiatives are similar. I downloaded their presentation that was authorized by the board. Santa Barbara is in the proposal stage as a PowerPoint presentation and handout, not a draft ordinance. It appears detailed and self-explanatory, and they do have an extensive application of about 20 items, and this will help them determine vested rights, which is a big controversy right now. So I suggest you look at that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeanette. Byron, are you addressing this, or Barbara, do you want to address it?
This item on your agenda today is regarding previously approved use permits and is unrelated to the item that was heard at the Planning Commission, which has not come to this board yet.
Okay. Okay. Any questions of any of the board members? Any other questions or comments from members of the public? So Byron, before you sit down, so this item is not directly related to the initiative that will be before the voters?
No, it's not. On Wednesday's Planning Commission, we did discuss an implementing ordinance with regard to the measure that will be coming to this board on a future agenda item. This is unrelated to that.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning again, Marty Richmond from Hollister. Apparently, everything is related to that, whether it's unrelated or related. No matter where you stand on any issue, and I certainly stand aside from many of the people in this room who've come to this podium and accused me of being in the employee of the oil industry. No matter where you stand, I expect that the Board of Supervisors will protect the public against lawsuits. We know they never go away We had the Los Valientos suit come back the other day. I thought that thing was dead 5 years ago. We see the lawsuits that continue to go on. We've had the PV2 lawsuit, then we had the appeal of the PV2 lawsuit, then now we have the lobbying of the Fish and Game, which will wind up eventually as another lawsuit, depending on how they rule. And lawsuits are the way the people who are opposed to anything fight everything. And when one side sues, the other side sues, and that goes both ways. Somehow, I would expect that the board doing their due diligence and the planning commission, whatever the issue, whether it's oil or whether it's sidewalks or whether it's gasoline stations, whatever the issue, I expect that this board should do its duty and make sure it protects the public against these terrible, terrible lawsuits that are designed to basically smash any progress in any direction. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Chairman Munzer, supervisors, staff. Christina Chavez White on behalf of San Benito United for Energy Independence, NOAA Measure J, and San Benito County Business Council. Quite frankly, if anybody needs convincing that Measure J goes too far, they don't need to look further than what County Council and the Planning Director are saying about the potential consequences of this flawed measure. While they definitely deserve credit for trying to lessen the damage to our county and our community of Measure J, the remedy is for voters to simply vote no and reject it this November. And their member, the planning commissioners, Byron Turner and Council Thompson, point out that Measure J contains language providing for exemptions and postponements for property owners and investors on a case-by-case basis. The measure is utterly silent on how to request them, how those decisions would be made, and what standards would be applied. At the Planning Commission hearing, the commission considered a proposed legislation to establish a 14-point process by which landowners and the petroleum companies could apply for postponements and exemptions. Under the proposal, all applications would have to be filed with the planning director. Requests on claims of unconstitutional taking of property would be decided by the supervisors, while those demanding more time to recoup investments would be sent to the planning commission. Applications for exemptions on other grounds would be left to the planning director. Fortunately, the Planning Commission approved the recommendations of staff to protect our county, but again, I want to point out this points to the flaws of this measure and concerns that our community brought forth. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just want to make sure the public understands, according to our interim planning director, this item before us has nothing to do with the initiative that will be before the voters.
Mr. Chair, we gave some members of the committee from both sides of the measure enough time to speak. Can we discuss the item that's before us, and then when we get to that point, we'll invite the entire community up on the time of that issue on the agenda?
Well, that's what I'm trying to say in a nice way.
Well, I just said it.
Yeah, I don't want to take much of your time. Andy Shaw, Coron. I live off of Ricardo Drive in Aromas. Just since we heard a case for the other side, the issue of whether there's a lawsuit or not a lawsuit is entirely up to the industry if it loses this initiative, as to whether it'll stand up all over the country where these laws have been passed by people protecting their community. They have stood up in court. So a threat of a lawsuit is hardly a good reason for people to make a decision.
Would anyone else like to address the board on this item? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the board?
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we adopt the findings set forth on attachment A of this AIT and to adopt ordinance number 928, amended in section 25-43-008 of the Title 25 of San Benito County Code regarding the terms of use permits.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? passes 5-0. We'll move on to item number 14. Mr. Espinoza?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we have our interim director of Public Works, Joe Hordell, here to answer any questions related to the AT&T cell tower lease agreement with the county of San Benito. And this particular item, the actual cell tower is located at Veterans Memorial Park. So we have Joe here to answer any questions from your board or from the public.
Mr. Chair, I'm the one that pulled
Okay.
this one, and there were two reasons why. And first of all, I'd like to be able to, as a board, bring this back to discuss the use of the monies. I know this particular item, these are new dollars that would go back to the general fund, or go to the general fund, but instead I would like the Veterans Commission to consider, and maybe we could give them direction as to how we can put this money to use back into the park. So that was my reason for pulling it. I'd like for us to consider that. I think it's important that we reinvest into the Veterans Park. There's need for additional lighting, there's need for better grounds, there's maintenance, and I'd like to incorporate all of that into a plan for capital improvements and even sustainability of the park with these funds. I know in the next 10 years, with an additional, with an option to renew 5 years, you're looking at about $405,000 plus 3% increase per year. So that's a substantial amount of money that could be put to good use there. So that's the direction that I'd like to take.
Supervisor De La Cruz?
Thank you. As the chair of the Vets Commission and our chair, Mr. Munzer, serving on that commission with 3 other veterans, that discussion has been discussed at many different meetings. And both Supervisor Jerry and myself expressed that because the county's actually allocating more dollars than actual money of revenue coming in, everything is going back to the Park Vets Commission. If you wish to set aside those funds, for future discussions, and wish to set aside those funds for special projects for the vets, besides the regular capital improvement project, the maintenance revenue that comes in, then yes, we can have that discussion. Because we felt, both Jerry and I, unless I'm wrong, is that any money that comes back to the county is really shorter than total dollars that go to the Vets Commission. So if it's another set of money that you wish to discuss and how to distribute that besides the regular capital improvement project and ongoing maintenance and hiring of staff to maintain that park, definitely.
Thank you.
Supervisor Barris and I discussed this a little bit because Supervisor De La Cruz and I have spent several years kind of educating the other members of the Vets Park Commission about how the county budget works. And Supervisor Barris kind of mentioned that maybe we could use this money to fund the capital improvement of installing new lighting, and I believe we do have a capital project for that. So that would be something I would be open to, where the money stays in the park.
Perfect.
And we can get a capital improvement project done that we're waiting for funding to come in.
Correct, and we have on today's agenda the well project, the completion of that. We've got in the CIP monies for doing lighting out there as kind of a first phase. We're also looking at some work with the skate parks. There's a number of different pieces that are moving forward. Clearly, funding is always one of those challenging pieces, but the board, as the policy direction for the county, really through the budgeting process, can go through and make those kinds of decisions of to allocate to the park or to keep it in the general fund.
So I think going forward, we probably need to agendize this on ours, and then it also probably needs to be agendized for the Vets Park Commission. Right. And get the input from the full Vets Park Commission also.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, which I thought it was a good idea when Margie presented the idea to me this morning, and I said, hey, it's a good idea. But there's some fiscal mechanisms that need to be addressed first before we go to the next step.
And I have a second part to this, to having pulled it. Camouflaging the tower, I actually have never, there's another tower there already. I've never noticed it, so obviously it was a good job of Is that expected to happen with this one as well?
Right, so the action today is for the lease for the property. There is a sketch in there for a design of what I call a wagon wheel. It's kind of one of the older designs. AT&T and the other companies do a number of designs that are stealth, so they basically look like just a pole, or like pine trees, or as light fixtures. This is in the outfield, so there's different ways to disguise it. So that's one of the things through the actual permitting, because they will still have to get permits to do this. That'd be part of the discussion I think we should have with the Vets Park Commission, is what's an appropriate design for it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions or comments from members of the board? Supervisor Botello?
Yeah, I had this pulled as well, and, you know, I agree with Supervisor Barrios that, you know, some of this money ought to be going right back to a Vets Park and maybe held in some sort of reserve. You know, as I think Supervisor De La Cruz remembered a couple of years ago, there was a water pipeline that broke that serviced the restrooms or the snack bar, and we didn't have the means to fix it. It ended up being fixed by the Little League or whoever was utilizing the parks, and I think that's not the way we want to operate. And so we have the opportunity to have some money here on an annual basis that could go back in reinvestment into the park, and look forward to have that discussion. My colleagues on the board to, you know, set that as an appropriate level. What I was looking at this lease, and I did not see it, but it may be there, you could correct me, is the lessor's ability to, you know, sign off on subleasing. At times, I'm not worried about so much the starting amount on the rent, 3% per year. That was fine, but as some of these towers sometimes get additional companies coming in, and all of a sudden this turns into a real money maker for the initial lessee. And I just wonder if we should have, you know, some sort of review process, as well as maybe, you know, a portion of additional revenues that are generated from this location if it's approved by the Planning Commission.
Actually, that is a really good question. Co-location is something that cities usually, or public agencies encourage to reduce the number of towers in the communities. I know that there's the ability for them to transfer the facility to a different entity. So if they were to sell the tower to a different company, they could do that with our approvals on it. I did not remember seeing something that would allow them to sublet for additional antennas. That still would have to come back through on the permitting side to be able to do that. So we have some controls that way. But I do not think there is something in here that would that speaks to that question. So,
because we're, you know, potentially leasing this out for 30 years.
It's 5 years with 4 5-year renewals built onto it, automatically kick through unless either party terminates.
See, I'm just thinking of it as a lessor's point of view. I know the, you know, the approval process is the approval process, but I would like to get a piece of the pie if it really becomes real lucrative.
Right, and there was a provision in here that as we went through those renewal phases, because both parties have 60-day renewal cancellation abilities, so we have the ability to entertain proposals from other entities. There's companies such as Crown Castle that actually lease properties, poles like this, and then sublease them to the carriers, that we would have the ability to actually go back at the end of those periods to put it on the market, and then AT&T has the ability to respond and match those bids to us. So there is some protection we built into it that way, that if somebody said they wanted to give us $5,000 a month, that we could go to AT&T and say, we're actually got a better offer, but that would be at the end of that first 5-year lease.
So it's a mutual option, it's not just the leasee's option.
Right, both parties have the ability to go and say, we're done. So we wanted to build in some protection for AT&T for them to amortize their facility, and so that's where that initial term shows up, and then we also recognized we didn't want to keep going out to bid, so we built the automatic renewals into it. So we tried to account for as much permutations. I think that's the little wrinkle on the co-location piece. The other piece, though, with the height of this, I think it is pretty hard to co-locate because of the separation vertically that they have to do. I don't think it's tall enough to be able to get a second set on there, but that's something we can double check with AT&T through the permitting process on this.
Okay, and is this company operating any other towers in San Bernardino County?
I would assume so. AT&T's got coverage. That's my carrier I use, so they have antennas around. I think it's a part of building out the network that as data traffic continues to increase, all the carriers are trying to fill in where they've got coverage gaps.
Because, yeah, that's something that I'm kind of concerned with, even for the county. Well, you know, I talked to the CAO about this last week with the narrow banding of our communications. We have some real serious gaps, and, you know, maybe if we could even work with these folks to solve some of those, you know, those dead spots.
Right.
It'd be great. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments of the board? Any questions or comments of members of the public on this item? Seeing none, what's the wishes of the board?
I will make a motion to approve per staff recommendation and authorize the chair to execute the lease agreement.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Passes 5-0. We'll move on to our first regular agenda item. I believe that's everything on the consent, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, Mr. Espinoza?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we're on item number 17 this morning. This is our first regular board item. This particular item was requested by your board, in particular Margie Barrios, Supervisor Barrios, to bring this item as a discussion item to the public as well as to the board and staff. So I'd like to defer this to Margie to introduce this.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and I'm hoping Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Bowen are here from the state of California, from the State Department of Conservation.
Was that?
They may, okay.
I think he was sitting in front.
Yeah, there was a gentleman sitting here, walked out, maybe, we're hoping that's the representative that that has accepted our invitation. I don't think he expected us to move so quickly on our agenda items. But anyway, I want to thank you for being here, and because I haven't met you personally, could you please introduce yourself? But before you do that, I really am grateful that you accepted the invitation to come here and present to our board and to our community regarding the state oil industry and the current regulations that we have, and perhaps how they affect San Benito County. So again, thank you.
Happy to do that. My name is Jason Marshall. I'm the Chief Deputy Director of the California State Department of Conservation. And if we have just a second, I have a PowerPoint presentation. If I could get that installed, who would I talk to here?
Get this out. It's going to take a few minutes here.
I apologize for this. It's a rather image-heavy presentation in terms of the graphics, so if you bear with me, please, we can put this together.
Now, are we expecting another representative from
No,
the department?
I'm sorry. Steve Bolin, who is the State Oil and Gas Supervisor who reports to me. Steve was not able to attend today. He was called to a meeting in Fullerton, and so he asked me to cover it. We were going to tag team the presentation. I've been to this rodeo once before, twice before, so I think I can cover it.
You can handle it. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
You know what? Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then while their staff is setting up, we'll take a 5-minute break. smoke from the fire.
That's fine, and I'm glad you were very clear with it. I can see you on October 7th.
I do.
Okay, are we ready to roll? Oh, we're missing. There's Anthony. Jaime must be in the back room. Oh, here he is. He's right here. Jaime's right here. Ray's right there, too.
Yes, I support you, and if I'd known you.
No, not at all. Not at all. Don't worry.
Sarah.
Okay.
If we can reconvene, I think our presenter is ready now.
Down here, we really appreciate it.
Glad to come down.
Great, great. Oh, look forward to it.
Also, if anybody wants to speak on this item, if you haven't already filled out a speaker card, will you please fill out one and bring it up to our clerk now?
Thank you. I got it.
When you're ready?
Whenever you're ready, Mr. Chair.
Yep, I think we're good to go.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of Supervisors here in San Benito County, it's my pleasure to be here today to talk a little bit about oil and gas operations in California. We're going to talk today about, and I'm hoping this is picking up from this far away on the mic. Let me know if I need to lean in a little more, please. We're going to talk a little bit today about some oil and gas production fundamentals. It's good to have everybody have a good common understanding of what really we're talking about when we talk about oil and gas production. We're going to talk a little bit about well stimulation in California, which was the subject of Senate Bill 4 last year, 2013, and the implementation of which we are in the middle of right now at the Department of Conservation. And we're going to talk a little bit about historic regulation and, again, those recent regulatory developments that I just mentioned. To begin with, let's talk a little bit about oil and gas, where it is, and how oil and gas operators get at it. This diagram behind me is a pretty good schematic. It shows two things I want to talk about. One of them is oil and gas and where it's found. So if you take a look here, I can't turn around too much. If you take a look here, you see that you've got multiple layers. Ignore that big thing in the middle for just a second. That's a well. We're going to talk about the things on the periphery of this first. We're going to talk about this area, and then it's also reflected over there. But we're talking about the geology right now. We're talking about the geology. So oil was formed millions of years ago by carboniferous material settling to the bottom of an ocean and then having some sort of sand or silt or something layer on top of it, and then another layer, and then more layers. Layers of different carboniferous material, sand, silt, sediments, whatever. And as they settle and compress, time and pressure and heat all work to convert them into oil. You end up with these zones that are differentiated here, an oil zone, and then these different areas, which on this diagram are referred to as cap rocks or seals. You get aquifers today in top layers of the ground where water has seeped in. So you've got a separation in, whoa, wrong button. You've got a separation here between the oil and the water in most places. And the reason you have that separation and you don't have the oil going to the surface is because of these confining layers, these cap rocks. If that didn't exist, you would have things like the La Brea tar pits. You would have things like Coal Oil Point, which is where oil seeps to the surface of the seafloor offshore of Santa Barbara. So this oil gets trapped in one of two different types of places. One would be, say, what we call the source rock, i.e. the place that it was originally formed, and then it did not migrate, perhaps because that rock was not porous enough for it to migrate out. Or it gets trapped in something that we would call a reservoir rock, which is to say now the oil has come out of the source rock. It is trying to flow to the lowest pressure area. It's higher pressure deeper in the earth, so it tries to flow up. As it flows up, it gets to one of these capped areas or a faulted area, and then it gets trapped in what we would then refer to as reservoir rock. It didn't originally have oil in it, but it does now. So that's the basics on oil and gas and where it is and where it gets trapped and how it stays in place. It's important to know about that because when we talk about wells and the well construction, now you're talking about operators, oil and gas operators, drilling from the surface of the earth down into an oil zone. As they do that, they pass through these other zones, say the aquifer zone. Well, it's long been practice in California for oil and gas well construction to make sure that we ensure something called zonal isolation. When an operator drills a well down, they pass through that aquifer zone. They are circulating mud down through the middle of the well and out up the outside of that drilling string. When they get past that aquifer level, they stop, and now they insert cement down that well, right down the center of that tube, and then squirt it back out the outside of that well so that it bonds between the rock that they just drilled through and that metal casing. That provides a seal against intrusion in that first layer, first and second layer, against water intruding into the well. So what do? They've got the cement hardens. What do? They've got a cement plug at the bottom, and then they've got cement all up the outside of it. They take a smaller, narrower drill, and they go right down the middle, and they punch out the bottom of that cement at the bottom and keep right on going down into the next formation. As they pass these different layers with fluids in them, they have to put cement around them. There's a requirement that they put cement about 500 feet above and below any of those water or hydrocarbon zones. And again, the whole point is to make sure that as they've punched a hole through all that geology to get to that oil zone, that there's no conduit back up outside the well, but back up into the water zone from the oil zone or the water down into the hydrocarbon zone. So, once the operators have drilled a well, they need to recover the oil that's in the well. There are really, when we talk about recovery of oil and gas resources, there's really three phases that we talk about in the history of oil and gas development of a field: primary, secondary, and tertiary. You know what, why don't we talk about it from the point of view of the images. So primary recovery is natural drive. Primary recovery in California still accounts for about 30% of the oil production in the state. And when we say natural drive, what we're talking about is all of the weight of rock pushing down thousands of feet, sometimes hundreds, but usually thousands of feet of rock pushing down on that oil formation wants to push that oil back up that well that's been drilled into the formation. So that's a natural drive to push the oil to the surface. In this particular image, there's a lot of drive, and it's blowing out the well. That's a geyser, a gusher. This is old. Take a closer look at the picture. You'll see it's got those old scratchings on old pictures. We don't like operators to do this. As a matter of fact, we've got a body of regulation to make sure that they don't have blowouts like this. But that's natural drive at work. It's also natural drive when the amount of pressure that's still remaining in the reservoir is only enough to push the oil into that well bore. Keep in mind, the well bore, once it was drilled all the way down to the bottom, and it had those, I didn't show you those, but I'll jump back real quick. Those perforations here, those perforations are how the oil gets into the well. So just be clear, once it's completed, they perforate the well so that the oil can come in. When the pressure pushes the oil into the well bore, maybe it's not enough pressure to push it all the way to the surface and come out of natural drive, but it's still enough to push into the well bore so that there's a hydrostatic level inside the well that's being maintained. The weight of the oil in the well is too much to push any farther up based on the amount of pressure that's being applied to it. That's where these horsehead drilling, pumping rigs you see up and down the state of California come in. They're lifting the oil out. That's a pumping motion, and it's pulling oil up. They may run for a couple of hours and then stop and allow that oil to be pushed back into the wellbore, more oil to be pushed into the wellbore, then they'll pump again. The operators don't want to pump on a dry hole. They want to wait until the oil pushes into the well and then lift it out. That also is considered primary recovery of oil and gas. Secondary recovery. Secondary recovery accounts for about 20% of oil and gas production in the state of California. And it's really the application of liquid water or gas to the formation to help maintain the pressure in the formation to drive oil into the well bore. So operators might push water in through an injector well here, water or gas, and as they push through the formation, the oil comes back up the producing well. Maybe it gets lifted. Usually it gets lifted. That's secondary hydrocarbon recovery. Tertiary, and again, it accounts for about 20%. If you're doing the math, I've now accounted for 50% of California's oil and gas production. Tertiary recovery is modifying either the oil or the formation to increase the flow into the well. So when an operator applies steam to a formation, we would consider that tertiary recovery. Steaming the oil thins it. It makes it more possible for it to flow to the well so that then it can be lifted out of the ground. Hydraulic fracturing, we're going to talk about that in a little while in much more depth. Hydraulic fracturing modifies the formation. So does acid matrix stimulation, so does acid fracking. These forms of tertiary recovery actually modify the formation itself. So in the case of hydraulic fracturing, it's creating cracks. Those cracks then create more surface space, surface area for oil to flow into the well. And that accounts, tertiary recovery in California accounts for about 51% of our total production. So where are we seeing oil and gas operations? Sorry, I just skipped right past that slide. Where are we seeing oil and gas operations in San Benito County? Well, there's three primary fields. You've got down here, Vallecillos, Bitterwater, and Hollister Field. Hollister is primarily a natural gas field. Bitterwater produces about 1,000 barrels of oil a year, and Vallecillos produces the rest of the oil produced in San Benito County, about 4,500, 4,700 barrels of oil a year. The actual numbers here, you can see, there's your totals for 2013. You'll see that I list active wells, 26 active producers, and 1 active disposal. You're probably scratching your head and saying, wait a minute, I know I've seen more than 26 wells in San Benito County. There's actually something on the order of 100 of them, but they're not all what we would consider active. Some of them are idle. So these are the active producers. The water, 57,000 barrels of water produced with that 5,600 barrels of oil. That's actually not uncommon in California. We see about 90, 95% what's referred to as water cut from the oil fields. In these hydrocarbon formations, it's not all hydrocarbon. It's a mix of gas, oil, and a lot of water. That water is very, very salty. And obviously, it's also been mixed with oil for thousands, millions of years. So when the operators separate the water from the oil at the surface, they've got to do something with that water. They tend to inject it back into the hydrocarbon zones that they came from. Now, sometimes they do that for that secondary recovery purpose, that enhanced oil recovery. They use the produced water to flush more oil out. Sometimes it's just disposal. In the case of the well that's being used in Vallecillos Field, it is listed as a water disposal well. It is not part of what we would call an EOR, enhanced oil recovery operation. So, let's talk a little bit about hydraulic fracturing. What is this practice that people are concerned about? You know, I forgot to give you some timelines, and it's really sort of important. Let me back up pardon me. This type of primary recovery has been going on in California since 1861. It's the first well in California. This type of recovery, secondary recovery, water flood, has been going on since 1905, 100 plus years. Tertiary recovery has been going on in California since the 1960s. Either steaming or hydraulic fracturing has been going on since the 1960s. So why today is hydraulic fracturing such a big deal nationwide? I'm not saying right here, and let me, point of clarification I need to make. I was reading the paper on Friday, and I learned that I was coming down to San Benito to oppose Measure J. I thought that was quite interesting. We quickly dashed off a note to the editor and indicated to them, reminding them that we are the regulator. We don't speak in support or opposition to local ordinances. We regulate the oil and gas industry. And my job today is really just to provide information. So when I talk about hydraulic fracturing, and I'm going to talk about it technically, and when I talk about the differences in California and how hydraulic fracturing has been used, I want to be clear for all of you in the audience and for you members of the Board of Supervisors, I'm not advocating for it. I'm simply observing some things that we as the regulator have observed and have noted as we write our own regulations for the state of California. So, what is this hydraulic fracturing? As I mentioned, there's a tertiary form of recovery where the operators want to increase the ability of the formation to flow oil to the well. So they break the formation. That's literally what they're doing. They are fracturing that formation to increase the surface area in that formation so that more oil can come through those fissures into that well. How do they do it? Well, all rock has what we refer to as a fracking pressure or a parting pressure, and that can differ at depth. And water doesn't compact, right? So you've got hydraulic farm equipment, you know that. Hydraulic tractors, whatever, you know that. Water is applied to the formation through the well, isolated by a packer. You saw that on the prior slide, the first slide, there was a packer in there. Isolated usually down in the formation so that the pressure is only downhole, and that pressure is applied until the rock breaks. Well, if that was all that the operators did with water, then there wouldn't be a purpose to having done that, because after they fracture the rock, it would simply collapse back onto itself. All of that weight is still there. All of that overburden of rock from the surface down would have pushed those fissures right back closed. So the operators want to leave a sand in those fissures, something to prop it open. They call it, inventively enough, they call it proppant. They want to leave something to prop those fissures open. So they use sand or ceramic beads, usually in the millimeter, 2 millimeter range size, and they want to get those into those fissures. Well, they can't get those things into the fissures just putting it in water. If you put sand in a bottle of water like this, it's going to sink all the way down to the bottom, right? Well, if they put just sand and water down their well, the sand's going to sink to the bottom of the well and stay mostly there and not propagate out into those fissures. So if you have children and you've ever played with something called slime, you know what slime is, that green stuff in the... Okay, that's what hydraulic fracturing fluid looks like. Sand suspends itself in that gel. It stays in that solution a little bit better. The sort of the politically incorrect comparison would be, think of it like the marshmallows in a Christmas Jell-O mold, right? They're floating in that gel. So sand stays in that slime, that gel, in suspension. There are chemicals used to make the water be that gelatinous form. Guar gum is one of them. The use of chemicals is one of the things that makes hydraulic fracturing controversial. But what are those chemicals? Well, one of them can be a gelling agent to make the water less water-like and more gel-like. Another chemical that would be used in hydraulic fracturing would be the things that they use for breakers, and there are multiple different chemicals that can be used. And the breaker is really just something that takes that gel and turns it back into water. So at a proper temperature or pressure or some combination that drives that chemical reaction, the breaker converts the gel back to water. So the sand that was shoved out into those fractures, when the breaker is applied, the sand stays in place and the water flows out and the fractures stay open. Other chemicals that are used, biocides. Biocides are used so that bacteria are not introduced into the formation, or any that are there, don't create biofilms. Biofilms, like pond scum, can clog up a well, and so operators don't like that, so they apply biocides. All of those chemical additives are a cause for people's concern, partly because sometimes the operators just say, look, it's a trade secret, and I don't want to tell you what's in them, and that makes people very nervous, and we get it, and that's why we address it in the regulations and why the legislature addressed it in SB 4. So that's hydraulic fracturing. This example that you see right here is a horizontal hydraulic fracture, and I want to just draw your attention to it for a second. That what you're seeing here is well, it's going to be different than a lot of what happens in California, because that ability to go horizontal is constrained a little bit in California. So one of the other points of controversy for hydraulic fracturing is the land use impacts. The reason I've got this slide here is because it's a great contrast. This is in North Dakota. North Dakota didn't have really much in the way of an oil and gas industry. I wouldn't say there was none, but there certainly wasn't the kind of oil and gas industry that they have now with the Bakken shale and the extraction of oil by using hydraulic fracturing. So, looking here, right at that line, right there, right below those tanks, everything below that is what the North Dakota looked like before hydraulic fracturing. Everything above that, and actually the whole picture really, becomes the new picture of rural North Dakota above the Bakken shale. You now have new infrastructure. You've got tanks, you've got more roads, you've got pads off here into the distance for wells. None of that existed. And that's a land use change. And as we went around the state doing about 13 different workshops for the regulations, 2 of them were actually here in the Salinas-Monterey area, a lot of things that we heard from people were concerns about some of those impacts I mentioned about hydraulic fracturing before, all packaged around a concern about a change in a way of life. So, where you didn't have hydraulic fracturing before, now you've introduced oil and gas industry to places where it wasn't. Where do we do hydraulic fracturing in California? We do it here. That's Lost Hills. If you're wondering where the hills are, they're lost. That's the west side of Kern County. About 660 of the oil and gas hydraulic fracturing operations that took place in 2012, 660 of them in California occurred in Lost Hills and neighboring Bell Ridge Field. There were 830. California does hydraulic fracturing in existing oil fields. We do it here. This is 2013. This, Lost Hills and Bell Ridge, that's Elk Hills. These are some other fields on the far west side of Kern County. This is Shafter Wasco. Up here is Coalinga. Down here, a couple in the Sespe field, and in here in the Santa Clarita area. All of these are areas where there's already oil and gas operations. And that's where we have been seeing hydraulic fracturing taking place in California for the last 30, 40 years. So where is it going to happen in the future? Well, we talk about the Monterey Shale. Here's one example of where the Monterey Shale might be. And remember, the oil and gas fields that I was just pointing out, right in here, running up there, there's some right in this area, right? There's San Benito County in this area. The entire LA Basin. The entire LA Basin is an oil field. It's one of the largest fields in the world. We just happen to have paved over it. And we still have oil and gas operations there. So where is this Monterey Shale? Where can we expect to see the new booming oil and gas operations? Well, some people would suggest that the Monterey Shale is here. Take a look there closer. That's San Francisco. I'm pretty sure nobody thinks that we're going to see oil and gas development in the old Candlestick Park or in Google's parking lot. Here's another example. This particular map shows a lot of Monterey Shale offshore. And here's another one that shows none of it being offshore, but reaching all the way up, bisecting San Benito County, running all the way up into Santa Clara. So where is this Monterey Shale? It's probably in all of those places. It's big. As a formation, it's big. The important question is not where is the Monterey Shale. The important question is where is the Monterey Shale going to be productive? Some of you have seen, more than a year ago, saw a projection that said there were 15 billion barrels of oil in the Monterey Shale. That was courtesy of the Energy Information Agency. They revised that number. It's down below 1 billion for their current revision. The question about the Monterey Shale and the question about where is hydraulic fracturing going to take place was actually taken up by the California Council of Science and Technology in a study that they just completed for the Bureau of Land Management. Their conclusion? Hydraulic fracturing in California is going to continue to take place in the existing oil fields, and they don't see it stepping out of those oil fields in the immediate future. Part of the problem is the oil and gas industry hasn't yet figured out how to produce the Monterey Shale. They haven't quite figured it out. Now, why? Well, let's take a look at the geology here. Earlier you saw some pancake geology. I used it as a demo to describe oil and gas formations. I used it to show the diagram of hydraulic fracturing. Here on the right, that's more like what California's geology looks like. It's folded and faulted. You don't get a lot of these really perfect, long, laid out deposits. You get broken up deposits here or here or here. bisected by faults, folded and bent. This kind of an oil and gas well completion, a horizontal completion, requires geology that doesn't look like what California has. So we've seen in our hydraulic fracturing operations, this is one of those places where we start talking about California's experience versus the rest of the world. We talked about the land use question a second ago. Now let's talk a little bit about the geology. California's geology doesn't lend itself very easily to high-volume horizontal frac jobs. We tend to see operators drilling vertical completions, and as you can see, just imagine the distance here. That area right there in that brown section for this diagram, that's the productive zone for that oil and gas well. There's another productive zone down there. This entire span is the productive zone for that well. So why did hydraulic fracturing become such a big deal? I think I started this. It became a big deal recently because operators combined the ability to make these long horizontal wells and fracture them. And that then created impacts, again, across the nation in different places where they hadn't seen oil and gas development before. One of the impacts of this, this difference in the geology in California is actually found in water use. So, wait, jump back one. If you were doing hydraulic fracturing through the well on the right, excuse me, the well on the left, you would be able to do multiple fracture stages. That diagram is intending to show something that stretches about a mile horizontally. You would do multiple fracking stages, and each stage uses water, chemicals, proppants. So one fracture job with many, many, many stages results in millions of gallons of water being used. In California, when you're doing a fracking job through a vertical section, the operator is only going to use fewer stages and thus less water. This is something that we had observed and sort of wondered how could we quantify it when a group called Ceres, it's a sustainability consulting firm out of Boston, released a report earlier this year. I believe it was in February of this year. And their report was really an advisory to investors about companies and how much water they used in their oil and gas operations. And what they came and concluded in that report, we weren't so interested in what they had to say for the investors. We were interested in what they had to say about the water use. What they concluded in that report is that horizontal hydraulic fracturing, high volume, used millions on average of gallons of water, whereas the vertical completion, hydraulic fracturing, used about 85% less water. California observed about 160,000 gallon water use per frac job in 2012, and the number looks to be going lower for 2013 by operators. Again, a difference attributable primarily to California's geology. So, we talked a little bit about the well construction earlier. I'm just going to cover the historic regulation that we laid SB4 on top of. And then we'll wrap this up and open it to questions. We have had for many, many years, decades, high well construction standards. That cement that I talked about, the casing thicknesses that I mentioned earlier, that's all the subject of existing regulation. The foundation of the regulation that the division has implemented has been zonal isolation. Keep the water out of the oil, keep the oil out of the water, make sure the oil comes up to the surface and doesn't get spilled all over the ground. It goes into tanks. We now have regulations that govern the facilities, the operation of the facilities at the surface, the pipelines, those collection tanks, and their spill prevention planning and contingencies. There is also regulation of that underground injection control, that secondary recovery method I was talking about, the water flood and then the tertiary, the steam flood. Those are all regulated by our division under the Underground Injection Control Program, which is delegated to us by the federal EPA, Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. Put that on them, they delegated it to the state. So that program we also administer, and again, the purpose of that is to make sure we've got zonal isolation, that the injection is going where the operator wants it to go and not into some other zone. It's into the hydrocarbon zone. It's where we want it to go to. And that what they're producing is coming back out of those producing wells and is not migrating out of some neighboring well that may be 30, 40 years old and the operator didn't know about it. They got to find those first, make sure they're competent before they do those injection projects. So what did SB4 add? Well, there's two phases really to SB4 implementation. The first one we already started in January of this year. The second one kicks in July 1st of next year. The rules that will be in effect on July 1st of next year are presently, we've gone out for 2 rounds of comment on those, and we're about to go out for the final round of comment. We need to finish those regulations by November 15th of this year, but they will, by statute, the legislature passed an extension last year, they will not become effective until July 1st of next year. Until July 1st of next year, the rules that are on the books today will be in effect. To explain those different rules, it's probably easier for me to describe what's going to be in place later and then tell you how the subset of that is in place right now. So, under the permanent regulations in July 1st, in addition to getting a permit from Dogger for drilling a well, now operators will need to get a permit for well stimulation. So well stimulation is hydraulic fracturing, acid matrix stimulation, or acid fracking. They'll need to get a specific permit from Dogger. They can apply for it at the same time, but it is a separate permit for doing the well stimulation. Part of that permitting process, you identify the well, identify the depth, identify the chemicals that you're going to use, identify the fracture pressure, identify how long you think the fractures are going to go, what's your model for that. The operators need to do neighbor notification. So gone are the days where an operator could pull a rig up, or 5 or 6 or 12 rigs up for a hydraulic fracturing job, and do the job and not have anybody know about it until it was done. Neighbor notification will be in place 30 days prior to the stim job occurring. Stim job, hydraulic fracturing, WST, all synonymous. So that notification will be for everybody within 1,500 feet of the well, and if the well happens to deviate off of the vertical, then project that deviation up to the surface of the earth and put a 500-foot buffer around that. Everybody in that zone will get notified of the hydraulic fracturing job and pertinent details of it. The operator is going to need to do an evaluation of the formation and of the wells prior to doing the hydraulic fracturing job. So what are they doing when they do a formation evaluation? This is a 5 times distance. So if the operator says, my model for the fracture job is 200 feet, then for 1,000 feet out, from that point in the earth where the hydraulic fracturing job is going to take place, say 6,000 feet down, that 1,000-foot sphere, that's the radius of a sphere, every geologic feature, fault, caprock needs to be identified as competent and not being a conduit for fluids out of that area. The wells. There will be an area evaluation of wells around that fracture job to make sure they aren't going to be conduits. One of the potential causes of contamination in a fracturing job is actually the interception of the fracture by another well. Let me put that another way. The fracture intersecting the well, because the well doesn't move, but the fracture does. So making sure that there are no wells in that area that could be intercepted, and if there are they competently constructed such that they will not be affected if the fracture intersects the well. That evaluation will need to happen before the hydraulic fracturing practice takes place. There's evaluation of the well prior to the actual frac job. So hydraulic fracturing, for argument's sake, say it's a 3,000-pound PSI fracture job. The entire system where that pressure will be applied under these regulations will be required to be tested to 125% of that. So what is that, 3,750, something like that, PSI? Spin that pressure up to that level, make sure that the whole system can withstand that pressure, and then go ahead and perforate the well and do the hydraulic fracturing job at the 3,000, the lower pressure. There are a couple of big changes in terms of water management and water monitoring in Senate Bill 4. The water management plan is required. That requires identification of the sourcing of the water, what other beneficial use could it have been put to, the volume that's going to be used. The aim here is to encourage the use of recycled water. We can talk about how that works if anybody is interested in Q&A. But there is also a very, very big change that it's really landmark when you think about it. There hasn't been baseline groundwater monitoring required for oil and gas operations ever. There hasn't been baseline water quality monitoring for ag operations either forever. But we now have baseline water quality monitoring requirements for hydraulic fracturing operations. Operators will need to identify if there is groundwater And in July, they will be doing this to criteria that are being adopted right now by the State Water Board. But they'll need to identify whether there's water, and if there is water, they're going to need to identify monitoring systems. The criteria for number of wells, sampling, what's going to be sampled for, that's being developed right now by the State Water Board. But that is new and big in the protection of public health, safety, and the environment. And one of the things that's important about it is to recognize is that we now have in these regulations not just increased prevention, but we also have monitoring after the fact. There are public disclosure requirements in the Senate Bill 4 regulations, disclosure about what chemicals were used, how did the frac job go, did it behave as expected. We are in the process of adopting those regulations right now, and we expect to be finished by November 15th. So that's the big picture of what's going to be required in July. What's required right now? Since January, when we adopted emergency regulations, the list of what's required actually looks pretty similar to what's going to be required in July. Some substantial differences. One, there is not a specific permit. The operators simply have to meet these requirements, and we are spending a lot of time making sure that the things they submit to us do meet those requirements. They have to do neighbor notification. It's been happening for 9 months, excuse me. They have to do the pre-testing of the wells to make sure that they're competent and able to withstand the pressure. That's been going on for frac jobs, stim jobs, the entire 9 months of this year so far. There are groundwater monitoring plans that have been put in place by oil and gas operators at our direction around those stim jobs that I showed you on that map earlier. Now, some of those jobs occur in places where there is no protected water, and when an operator wants to say, hey, there's no water over here on the west side of Kern County, they just have to prove it. And some of them have managed to do it, but others have discovered that that old saw that many of them thought was true, there is no water on the west side. There is water on the west side in some places, and so now they have groundwater monitoring plans around those wells. Disclosure of the hydraulic fracturing fluid content is required. You can find it on our website right now if you're interested. And the public disclosure after the fact is also required. So a great amount of what will eventually be required in 2015 is required now of oil and gas operators under state regulation. A couple other pieces just to wrap up here on SB4. There is an EIR that we are conducting on well stimulation as a project. Most people think about an EIR as, you know, we're doing an impact report for a subdivision or, you know, a new shopping mall or something like that. This is an EIR on a process, well stimulation. It's kind of interesting. It's pretty broad. It's a bit of a challenge. We expect to have our first administrative draft to us shortly. We expect to be releasing it for circulation sometime in Q4 of this year. And then it will become statewide an EIR for people to review and comment on. Anybody can do it. There's also an independent study. This is being conducted by our parent agency, the Natural Resources Agency, and it's being conducted by CCST. The reason CCST was picked, well, frankly, they're independent, they do peer review, and they're already halfway down the road with the investment they were making in the BLM study on hydraulic fracturing. SB4 provides some very specific issues that they want addressed, that the legislature wants addressed by that study, and so that's the addition that's being added on, and we expect the first volume, I guess is a better way of putting that, by January, with 2 subsequent volumes over the coming 6 months after that. Mr. Chairman, board members, that concludes my presentation. We've covered a lot of ground. We talked about oil and gas structures, well construction, production methods, dealt a fair amount on hydraulic fracturing and on the regulations. It's a lot to cover in 40 minutes, I think is what we just did. But I thank you for your patience, and I'm available for questions for quite some time.
Are there any questions of the board?
I have one question, Mr. Marshall, right?
Yes.
Got the name right. Are our regulations, I know we're governed, sounds like we're governed by the federal government, but are other states as strict as we are? Or do they just don't have them?
They aren't. They are not. There are provisions in the California Senate Bill 4 regulations that are found no other place. What we have referred to as the fracture radial analysis, what are the other wells in the area around the well stem job, and are there potential conduits? That doesn't exist in any other state. Some of our our well construction standards themselves are stronger than other states as well, but those weren't changed really by Senate Bill 4. And point of clarification, most of the California oil and gas regulation, actually all of the California oil and gas regulation is found in the California Code of Regulations. The way that the federal government got involved in this is when they passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they said there are rules that we want you to have as a minimum standard for dealing with injection of produced fluids, those waters that come up out of the hydrocarbon zones. Individual states, if they already had rules on the books, could apply to the federal government and say, hey, ours are as strong or stronger than yours. Why don't you just go ahead and not bother with trying to have US EPA impose basically the same rules, just defer to ours. And so if EPA agreed, and they did in 1982, 83, if EPA agreed, then that was the delegation of what they call primacy. So we're implementing the Safe Drinking Water Act spirit, but we're doing it with California law that just happens to mirror the Safe Drinking Water Act.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Patel?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for a very good presentation and outline what your agency does. My, concern and questions kind of evolved with SB4. A lot of those issues, as you probably are aware, our county addressed with our own local gas and oil revision with our ordinance, and we understand our responsibility as well as what your agency's responsibility is. And one of the things that has concerned me deeply, as we adopted our new regulations and requirements, was our ability to enforce compliance. And with SB4, obviously, it appears that you have a whole lot more responsibility and need for oversight to have the oil companies comply with the new regulations. And one of the things that has bothered me as got involved in this issue is our local agencies and even the state agencies' credibility to make sure that these companies are in compliance of the requirements. And it's been reported, and I don't know if it's factual or not factual, that Dogger has missed some inspection requirements in other oil fields. Is that how is that being addressed as you implement the new SB4 rules?
When the legislature passed SB4, one of the things that we told them very clearly is we're going to need a lot of people to enforce this law. We have asked for, and they granted us in this budget, approximately 65 additional staff. Most of them will be field staff. And their sole purpose is really making sure that they get out to these various inspections. The pressure testing, for instance, that I mentioned has to be done prior to a fracture job. The actual fracture job itself, those are things that the operator needs to give us the opportunity to come out and inspect and to witness. The frequency with which we get out and witness blowout prevention equipment under the current law is pretty good. And what we're using as a model for staffing levels is that blowout prevention equipment requirement. Relative to other forms of inspection, the UIC programs, the underground injection control programs, those require an annual inspection. And I believe most of them do, though I would be interested in knowing if there are any instances where that isn't happening, where people are concerned that maybe they haven't seen a Dogger truck anytime in the recent memory. I'd like to know about that so we can make sure that we've got those people out there. We have districts. We're in District 5 right now, which is centered in Coalinga. And Tim Boardman, that district deputy, he actually has been up here with me in the last 6 months. But, he covers all the way out into the High Sierras. Not that there's very much oil and gas operation out there, but all of Fresno, all of down to Kings County. So again, if if he and his crew are missing some, I'd like to know about it, because I'd like to make sure that they've got the right amount of staffing and they've got the right priorities.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Rivas?
Yeah, I want to say that I appreciate your time and you being here this morning. And I'm really glad that you brought up SB4, because SB4, I think, is well-intended, but, although it's already been implemented, I believe it falls short. And the things I'm most concerned about, I have a master's in public administration, so I certainly know that over time, I would anticipate that the law would improve through, more rules, more regulations, and I'm sure your agency will work out the kinks. But, really the concerns I have is, what I really like about SB4 is the fact that the new law would provide at least some additional information as far as where fracking is going to occur in our states. But what I really like is how much water and what the toxic chemicals are going to be used have to be, there's the disclosure requirements, right?
Yep.
My concern, however, is the fact that when you go to the website and you look at these disclosures, it looks like they're missing information. I could go to another website, like I think it's Frac Focus, and I could, and according to their statistics and their data, there's at least 5 companies that are fracking here in California. But on the Dogger website, there's only 1 listed on there. And what's troubling is that a lot of the data that's important for me is missing on the Dogger website, our regulatory agency here for the state. And in particular, as far as the data that's missing is the required, the chemical analysis of the fluid that comes out of the well after it's fracked, because that's what I'm most concerned about. And that's why I support our local effort to, ban the use of fracking and high-intensity oil operations here locally, because that's, in my opinion, the only true way that we can avert the risk that's associated with these operations. So, I'm not sure if you can answer that. I would imagine that over time, it would improve, and that those disclosure requirements, I'm not sure if it's an enforcement issue now, or how we can make sure that that disclosure is going to occur.
So, what you're observing by looking at Frac Focus and looking at the department's website, you're observing the development of this rule and this disclosure process in real time. So to maybe fill in some of the procedural steps that lead to that problem, and we know it's a problem and we're working to resolve it. Operators are required to do their notification to Frac Focus within 60 days, and they report what I will characterize that body of information as subset A. We require them to give us an additional chunk of information that is subset B. So you've got hydraulic fracturing operations are what gets reported to Frac Focus, but what doesn't get reported to Frac Focus are acid matrix stim jobs, acid fracking, because that's not what Frac Focus is built for. So that becomes part of this subset B. There's other information that we ask operators to provide us. Now, when we started this process, what we said is, okay, operators, you give Frac Focus the information for A, and we'll get it from Frac Focus, and we will merge it with the data you give us in subset B, and we will do that work. And to be perfectly candid, that was a mistake. What we changed in June, July, when we readopted the emergency regulations, we just told the operators, you need to give Frac Focus this subset A, and when you give us the information you're supposed to give us A and B together at the same time. So we're stopping doing that merging. One of the other things that we're having some difficulty with, and if you take a look at the website, you're going to notice one company in particular that has a lot of reported stim jobs on our website, Era Energy. They are the largest user of well stimulation in the state. They're the company that did those 660 stim jobs in Bell Ridge and Lost Hills. They have figured it out. They know what they have to do with regard to the reporting. There are a number of smaller other energy companies, I'll choose not to name them, who are still working to figure out how they get us the right information. And part of their challenge has been, frankly, getting the information from their service provider. Hydraulic fracturing is not something that most operators do themselves. They contract out for it to names that you would recognize like Halliburton, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes. Baker Hughes notably announced earlier this year that they were not going to even try to assert any claims of trade secrecy. And so they just are an open book, which has made, in my view, has made their reporting easier. We are still working with some of the other operators and thus some of their service providers, service companies, to make sure that we get the information in a form that is accurate. The reason you don't see all of the STEM jobs reported on the department's website is because, frankly, we've made a decision that it would be better to not report half information and get those operators to provide it to us. My patience with them and getting it right is waning. This is indeed what I will refer to as a paper violation. I don't want anybody to forget that what's happening with regard to that disclosure changes nothing about the environmental protection that has gone on with regard to those STEM jobs. They still had the pressure testing done. They still had the neighbor notification done. All of those things all happened. The problem is just that we haven't yet gotten the information about the job posted on the website because we're still arm wrestling with the operator to get us that information. There's a pretty healthy penalty that's assessed under SB4 for failure to comply. It's $10,000 a day per violation. That's a big, big number, and it may need to be invoked in order to get their attention.
Good? Okay.
I do have one more
Okay.
that I just thought of. You mentioned that they have to report the chemicals that are being used. Are there only certain chemicals that are actually approved by the department? I mean, because they could state a whole slew of them, but are they all legal and protected or approved?
Under state law, there is no rule that tells them which chemicals they can or can't inject into a hydrocarbon zone. However, if they choose to inject certain chemicals, diesel fuel among them, if they choose to insert certain substances, then different regulatory requirements kick in. For instance, the full suite of the underground injection control program does not apply. Actually, the full suite of the underground injection control program does not apply to hydraulic fracturing. That's carved out by Senate Bill 4. But if you inject diesel, then all of a sudden, yeah, the whole UIC program comes into play, and that's a trigger that's in federal law.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
All right, before I open it up to the public, I have a list of rules that I tend to read if I feel that the meeting can get unruly. Some of you have heard them, maybe you even know them by heart already, but I want to read them again. There will be a 3-minute limit to each speaker. When you hear the timer go off, I will ask you to wrap up. You are to address the members of the Board of Supervisors, not the audience. There will be no borrowing of minutes from someone else. No second trips to the microphone unless asked by a member of the Board of Supervisors. No shouting, talking, or asking questions from your seat. No clapping, no cheering, no disrespecting any member of the Board of Supervisors, staff, or another member of the audience. I will not allow this meeting to be unruly, and I thank you in advance for your cooperation. With that, do we have speaker cards?
Larry Rebecki?
Mr. Chairman, if I may ask a quick question, would you like me to remain to?
If you want to sit in the front
Okay.
row in case there's anything that you need to address. Yes, thank you.
Good morning, the Board of Supervisors. I'd like to thank the representative from Dogger. It was a very informative presentation, and I think he answered some questions that we all have. I feel as if, though, that as Supervisor Bothello, his concern was that Dogger itself and many agencies at the state level and at the county level are understaffed. Now, he mentioned they're going to hire an additional 65, and I think that would be good because We do have a history in our country and throughout the state of problems with regulatory agencies. An ongoing problem we have with the PUC and PG&E, the investigations that are going on in Sacramento. And of course, we all remember the 2008 financial crisis on Wall Street with the SEC. A lot of times regulatory commissions or agencies are not functional. They can also be corrupt. There are many loopholes in these agencies. And so it was enlightening to hear that they're going to have additional staff. But that in itself doesn't guarantee that loopholes won't continue to exist, that the oil industry won't do things when nobody's looking. We drive down the freeway. We see the CHP coming, everybody slows down. But as soon as he's out of sight, everybody speeds up. So this is the type of things that we can expect from the oil industry. When these Dogger reps are out of sight, who knows what's going to go out in the country. We have problems in staffing at our county level. I know a lot of the people in South County don't have sheriff protection. So when we look at these agencies, they're only as good as they're staffed and if they do actually enforce the regulations that are on the book. Finally, I'd like to read something a friend of mine said in regards to SB4. And this person said, the SB4 tells you how you are going to get poisoned, but it does not stop you from getting poisoned. And thank you.
Andy Shaw Rose.
Yes, Andy Shaw, Corona. I want to thank my fellow employee of the state. I was employed by the state, by the Department of Corrections for 20 years. First of all, I want to raise a couple of questions. The industry, first I'm going to read a quote from Senator Bill Monning, who is one of the co-authors of SB4. I asked for what he felt about, he's endorsed our initiative, by the way. He said, I supported a statewide moratorium on fracking and believe that it is also an appropriate measure to protect public health and environmental safety at the county level. We must use the precautionary principle with respect to any new technology or chemical use that has not been proven to be safe. Humans and our environment should not be the guinea pigs for untested drilling methods, including fracking. And the water dependency for fracking does not make sense amidst the current drought crisis. Now, when we talk about fracking in our area and we talk about the precautions made to stop them from leaking, Dr. Anthony Ingraffi, a professor of engineering at Cornell, said that 5 to 6% of all wells are already compromised from the moment that they're created. And then over time they deteriorate further. Imagine how much quicker these cement straws going through the various layers will deteriorate in an area of high seismic activity. Look at your driveway to see what happens to cement over time. Now, in our county, and you've seen the economic report, they're projecting 1,000 wells down at the Indian Project. Imagine 1,000 concrete straws going through a shallow aquifer, and imagine that 5 to 6% of them might already have problems. And then imagine what happens to them over time when you've now connected all the layers with these concrete straws, which become avenues for movement. Essentially, it's a high-risk behavior. It compromises what we've got going for us already in our county. And in the long run, it's probably not the best of ideas. If it turns out that the SB4 regime works really, really well in other places, people in our county can reverse themselves. A citizens' initiative is not permanent. But so that's my comments. Thank you.
Marvin Jones.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Supervisor, it was a very interesting presentation of Mr. Marshall presented, very informative, almost understood it. The picture I gave you earlier reference at the bottom is for fracking in Colorado, where they do the horizontal one. It was interesting that it doesn't work that well with all of our folds and faults that we have here. A question about Dogger and Kern County. So rumor came out of the assembly that Dogger shut down a number of properly permitted oil wells in Kern County. There was some injection wells that were shut down, the recycled wastewater type wells that were shut down. That's been in the paper. I've not found a creditable hard source about the Dogger shutting down properly permitted wells, but the same rumor says that the petroleum industry has sued Dogger for $60 billion for their inverse condemnation, if you will. When we implement Measure J here in San Benito County, the inverse condemnation monies you may be speaking of is a 1/10% of what will happen in Kern County. That's $60 million. If that rumor is substantiated, you better really consider putting a larger amount of reserve in your budget. Thank you.
Jeanette Langstaff?
I'm Jeanette Langstaff, a resident in Hollister, and you're talking about vertical stages of wells using less water than some of the other water used in other states. Well, I think we need to know how deep these vertical wells are, so we know exactly what we're talking about. And I'd like to know also, I'm under the impression we do have horizontal wells in this state too. And so, it has been mentioned that in the last year, there are some wells that are showing a high use of water. So this is vague here. But as I was reading the introductory part of this report online, 200 more pages, it's too much to read. So the introductory had to balance this report and had to tell what was neglected in this report, and that it needed much more time, really, to be an accurate assessment, because it stated that this report provides a synthesis and assessment up to February 2014 on literature. The source that meets the highest standard of scientific quality control is very limited. So you had very limited literature, relevant literature. For instance, there is little information on water demand in California for hydraulic fracturing. There was a need for other material to be considered as well records, government data, and reports. So this is so-called gray literature. They analyze voluntary web-based databases such as FracFocus, page 20 in this introductory report, where specific data on California was not found. Research was obtained from analogs from other locations while recognizing the limitations of such. On page 21, records filed with Dogger in the past do not comprehensively record well stimulation events. Voluntarily submitted data such as FracFocus are not required to be either complete or accurate. These challenges with the quality of data are described to allow transparency of the limitations in these conclusions. Oil companies spend billions of dollars per year on research and development, IHS 2013, whereas the government's spending for all research related to fossil fuels is hundreds of millions of dollars per year. This disparity in private versus public information makes it particularly difficult to ascertain prospects for application of well stimulation in the future. For this study, pursuant to California SB 4, no well records have been available. Some important data gaps will likely remain as depth of the base of groundwater, which varies with definition of groundwater, location, etc. There's going to be many questions that go unanswered, and that's why we need much more time to analyze the danger of this petroleum operation. Thank you.
Marty Richmond?
Good morning again, Marty Richmond from Hulsa. Thank you, Mr. Marshall, for that interesting, I learned a few things. I won't fight the same old fight here, but I'm going to say this. The best example of whether it's safe or whether it's not safe is our neighbors, Monterey County. They have somewhere between 550 and 650 wells, is my understanding, in Monterey County, and pump an enormous amount of oil, and they pump an enormous amount of gas. Supervisor Rivas worked in Monterey County, I think, a couple of years. He's spoken here about the crime that comes with these oil fields, the prostitution that comes with these oil fields, the gambling, the drug. It didn't seem to come to Monterey County. I don't know why. Maybe it's the level of people they have there. I have no idea, versus North Dakota. But I never heard prior to this him mention it in Monterey County. They're doing just fine. Council Member Alejo said he doesn't know of one case of contamination in Monterey County. None. Also, I'd like to point out, we are net energy users here. Not only the United States, not only California is a net energy user, San Benito County is a net energy user. 98% of our gasoline, 99% of our gasoline, 98% of our diesel, 98% of our gas comes from outside this county. We produce almost nothing. If the folks who are against drilling, and they are against drilling, when they say no fracking, they're essentially crossing at least 50% off the board here in Monterey County, would reduce their use of energy by 98%, they would have a good argument. Meanwhile, we use 16 million gallons of gasoline a year for our people here who live in Monterey County, and about 1.47 million gallons of diesel fuel. We produce almost nothing. We produce less than 2% of the natural gas we use to heat our homes. So what we're saying to everybody is, you go out and make the oil for us. You go out and make the gas for us. We have that capability, or we might have that capability in the future. We don't know. But we refuse to do it because it's not good for us. It's good for you. I also would like to point out, and I have before, that the state of California does not get the same import mix as the rest of the nation. Our biggest foreign servicer is Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Carl Scout.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and honorable board members. Carl Scow, longtime resident here. I'd like to thank you. I know that there are differences of opinions on this board. I'd like to thank you in the civil way that you treat each other. I would hope that the audience here could do the same. I walked in today. I sat down next to a friend of mine to talk about old cars. I immediately got lambasted by one party of the audience on my opinion. I don't even know the gentleman. 40 days from now, we are going to be a community again. However this thing plays out, whatever goes on, we're going to be a community. I hope everybody can act civilly and we can get this behind us and talk and have the right to disagree with each other. Thank you.
Would anyone else from the public like to address the board on this item?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Melissa Duflock. I'm from San Ardo, over in Monterey County. And I wanted to point out that this anti-fracking, fracking sounds really scary and it sounds like the environmentally correct thing to do, but this isn't anti-fracking. This is absolutely anti-oil production. I want to point out that in your initiative, Section 1, under Purpose and Findings, it includes cyclic steam injection, under the definition of high-intensity petroleum operations. Cyclic steam injection is the traditional form that we use in San Ardo. Then there's also the effects of this initiative under B, under the same sections, and it says it includes steam injection under the broader definition of recovery wells. And then also, and under enhanced recovery wells. So the other thing is that this definitely includes all oil production. And then it gives 1 up to 3 years for illegal use to become a non-conforming use for it to end. Well, you know, this just to me sounds like, as people have been saying earlier today, lawsuits are waiting to happen. This sounds like a regulatory taking and just compensation would be due. The things I don't understand are page 8.1, it bans oil production on lands designated rural. Not sure what your county defines rural as, but I think that's where you want oil production, not in the cities. And the other thing I wasn't too sure about was the language of the low-intensity oil production. Would that limit a current use? I'm not sure. It's just something to look at. And then just one last thing to ponder, something to take home when you go to bed tonight and think about. Chevron is currently working with the Coelho Water District in Bakersfield, and they're actually producing water for agriculture. Because in Kern County, when you produce 1 barrel of oil, you're also producing 9 barrels of water. And so in a time of drought, I would think, hey, can we find a solution with the oil company to help provide water for agriculture? Just something to think about. Thank you.
Is there anyone else that'd like to address the board?
Good morning. My name is Margaret Rebecki, and I'm the initiative in Measure J. I would like to say that I know we're not fracking, and we're not just using that word. We're trying to prevent fracking, just like you immunize yourself with your measles shots, just to prevent it. Besides, who wants to have Coalinga next to the Pinnacles National Park, which is 6 miles away? We have no business, oil companies have no business next to our national park. We got condors, we got wildlife. Why do you think Congressman Sanfar has endorsed us? He supports us. He gets it. No, we're not trying to frighten people. We're trying to protect our county. I've been here for 40 years, and we're not outsiders the way people are saying or the way those oil companies are saying. We just don't trust, I don't trust oil companies. Do I believe them? No, I don't. When you mentioned the fact that why is everybody interested in fracking? Let's look at North Dakota. Let's look at Pennsylvania. Let's look at Oklahoma. Oklahoma has earthquakes. We've seen what is damaged. We've seen how their cattle have tumors and everything when the water has been contaminated. Thank God I live in California that we have strict rules. But I love my county, and I do not want to see a Coalinga or San Ardo next to our Pinnacles. That is why I am supporting and I'm saying yes to Measure J. Yes, we have regulations here, but in Kern County, we also fail to see that there are poor people there who are having bloody nose. There are people who do have asthma. There are people who do have other problems caused by this fracking. There are orchards who have been destroyed by chemicals and that. So it's like the book, the mouse, you give a mouse a cookie, then he wants a glass of milk, then you give him a glass of milk, then he wants to stay overnight. Well, we do not want the oil companies to stay overnight next to our Pinnacles, and we do not want a Coalinga and a San Ardo next to the Pinnacles. And so we're not trying to scare people. I am a concerned environmentalist. I am trying to protect our environment. My county, we cannot afford to have an accident like other states have. Watch the movie Gasland, watch the movie Promised Land, watch all this. What proof do we need? We have enough proof with the other states, and we don't want fracking in California altogether. Thank you.
Is there anyone else that'd like to address the board?
Good morning, and thank you for hosting this forum. I appreciate the candid and informative presentation by Mr. Marshall from Dogger. I'll limit my conversation or my remarks to this particular discussion, and what I get is the takeaway from the presentation from Mr. Marshall. First of all, I wasn't able to be here for the whole thing because I was pumping water for our cows. And last year, I had to haul water 3,000 gallons a day for about 60 days for our cattle. I'm a cattle rancher. And so I really understand in a quite visceral way the preciousness of our water resources. And I also understand, after reading the report from the scientists at the Lawrence Livermore Labs and hearing Mr. Marshall's presentation, that we have very limited sources of data on what is actually going on relative to these technologies. And the data that we do have has been, up till now, produced by the oil companies themselves. And there's plenty of evidence to encourage us to be skeptical of what that data actually tells us and how informed we actually are. I'm also concerned with the government's capacity to monitor these things, these wells that are dispersed geographically and quite isolated. Mr. Marshall from Dogger said that the smaller companies are not up to speed with reporting some of this data. Some of the smaller companies are not up to speed with reporting this data. That's who we're dealing with. We are dealing with these smaller companies that are not up to speed reporting the data. Why should we expect them to be competent in the permitted uses of these technologies? If our groundwater were not precious and scarce, extremely scarce, they got 1 inch of rain in Bitterwater last year, I might be inclined to take greater risks along these lines. As it is, I am not confident in the oil and gas companies to get it right, nor am I confident in Dogger's current capacity to adequately preserve the integrity of our county's groundwater. We do not depend on local sources of oil for our life, as Mr. Richmond pointed out. We do depend, and the wildlife and so forth, our businesses depend on local sources of groundwater. Oil and water don't mix. If in the future we learn that these technologies are safe, we can unban it. If we're mistaken and we make mistakes with our groundwater, we don't know when we can fix that.
Anyone else from the audience?
I'm Joe Spencer from, Joe more or less said what I wanted to say, but the only thing I want to add is like our house well at Bear Valley now pumps 9 minutes, sets for an hour. So that's just what we get for water for us and for the cattle. And it's going to come to a point, I think, when you go from Piscina south, everybody would like to get more gasoline for the United States and everything else. But when it's the commodity of water, just won't be able to use, you won't be able to take the amount of water that we have there and make enough oil to help anything. When is the point going to be where a gallon of gas and a gallon of water are about the same for for cost or for money or for us to use.
Good morning again. Christina Chavez Wyatt of San Benito County Business Council and Committee of San Benito United No on Measure J. I think it's important to note that while California communities are still reliant on oil and gas for 75% of our energy portfolio to fuel our transportation, specifically because we feed the world here in San Benito County with our wonderful organic agriculture, our industrial uses, residential, commercial, and electric power needs, we feel it's best that we support energy independence, the tax benefits, the jobs, and the economic and environmental benefits that come with it. Of all oil and gases produced in California, it's produced under the most stringent environmental protections in the world, as Mr. Marshall described to you. Imported oil must come by train, ocean tanker, or pipeline, further increasing the cost and risk to the environment. Foreign oil comes from countries with few environmental protections, and for most importantly, worker protections as we have here. We produce 200 million barrels of oil here in California, but still it only covers 37% of our intense energy needs. Many of those we need to feed and fuel the minds of our community, including technology and research, and escapes for our community and the world with our great hospitality industry. California's population, again, is expected to increase more than a quarter by 2050. We need to support our communities and their ability to have energy. I think it's also important, as Melissa Duflock regarded the San Ardo oil field, that Veolia, who runs our sewage treatment plant here, is the same company that operates the reverse osmosis plant for the Chevron steam injection operations in San Ardo, where they process 2,400 acre feet or 780 million gallons of fresh water per year that's used to recharge the Salinas River aquifer, which is upstream of $4 billion in agriculture. This is net clean water that's pulled from the oil field at a rate of 14 barrels of water per barrel of oil. It's also estimated that steam accounts for up to 60% of oil that's produced in California, which is about 160 million barrels. Eliminating steam injection, which has been used extensively in California, pioneered at the San Ardo oil field in southern Monterey County in 1962, the amount would equate to 79 ocean tankers, 227,995 plus rail cars, and gas rationing, less driving, and higher energy and gas prices for our community. We need to account for environmental impacts of alternatives, but it's important that we don't cut our communities off at the socks. Here's a non-exclusive list of organizations that, in addition to DOGGR, regulate the oil and gas industry in San Benito County. The California Air Resources Control Board and the Regional Board, of which Mr. Munzer is on the board, fortunately advocating for our community. The U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, the EPA, the Regional Air Pollution Control Boards, the State Fire Marshal, Office of Spill Prevention and Response, the DMV, the CHP, Cal OSHA, the U.S. EPA, Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Office of Emergency Services, the Regional Water Quality Control Boards, the California Department of Fish and Game, the California Department of Substance Control, and thankfully our very competent, though small, San Benito County Planning and Permitting staff, environmental health, fire, and sheriff. I have spoke with your environmental director, Daryl Wong, on a couple occasions.
Summarize.
And during his 10-year tenure, he has not had any issue with our small oil operations. Again, I do think our county should be commended with the hard work and 6 months that was brokered by Supervisor Munzer and Supervisor Patello last year, providing us an additional 21 pages of protections moving forward. And again, we need to focus on
If you can summarize.
Absolutely, thank you. Is what, in addition to hydraulic fracturing, is included in this very dangerous initiatives being proposed by our county, which is a general plan amendment by insertion. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the board. My name is Paul Ravel. I'm a local attorney. I'm also a resident and an heir to about 15 acres that would be prohibited from having any oil or gas operations on it if this measure were to pass. We've been told here today that Measure J is intended to prevent hydraulic fracturing. Measure J isn't limited to hydraulic fracturing. Measure J prohibits the application of acid to a well. It prohibits the injection of water, steam, polymers, CO2, and other gases to a well, activities that have occurred in California since the early 1900s. I believe the reason I'm here before you this morning is to request that the board take this opportunity to educate the public and to educate themselves to understand where Measure J leaves us if it passes. County staff and proponents are saying that mining activities can still occur in about 90% of the unincorporated area of San Benito County. My question is, what mining activities are left if San Benito County passes Measure J? And are those activities even viable in San Benito County, given our geology and the nature of the oil that is located here? A prior speaker also mentioned that we don't want to become North Dakota. Very recently, within the last couple of days, there was a study released, and North Dakota experienced the largest gains in income in the country over the last year. That doesn't sound too bad in a county such as ours in California that doesn't even make the state average income per capita. Thank you very much.
Is there anyone else that'd like to address the board at this time? Seeing none, Mr. Marshall, I want to thank you for your presentation and your time here. And with that, I think we'll take a 10-minute break. Okay, and thank you, everybody, for your being civil and obeying my little set of rules.
I don't have a Coke.
got a lot of work to do yet.
I've had a request if we can move item number 21 up to the next item that we'll hear. Is that okay with the rest of the board? Mr. Espinoza?
So we're at item number 21 this morning. First of all, this particular item was requested of your board to have administration work on the CBOs and the grant application, the guidelines for this next upcoming fiscal year, 15-16. So today, our staff has actually worked on this along with two supervisors, Supervisors Barrios and Supervisor Jaime de la Cruz, to look at the grant process. Today what we're going to do is we're going to discuss what we have. Melinda actually has a few papers that she'd like to pass out. There are a couple of edits to the first page, makes it a little easier to read. And other than that, yeah, so we have Melinda Casillas here. She's our management analyst. She'll be talking a little bit about this. What we've done is we've actually created a timeline of the grant process, notification to the committee on October 15th for allocation. Melinda has looked at some numbers and has some projections, but it'll probably be more accurate in the next month or so. We also have a few other items, but the last item, on item number 8, will be coming back to your board after the committee's gone over the numbers and gone over the application, and will be coming back to your board during one of the special budget meetings to discuss the applicants, and at that point we'll decide who will receive grant funding for the out of the 6% for tax that we receive from our budget. So again, we have Melinda Casillas here, and then as well as our two supervisors that can comment on this particular item.
As Ray explained during budget hearings, you asked for us to come back with some new guidelines and criteria for the CBO, community-based organization guidelines for eligibility. And before you, you have a proposal application packet. It has, it contains the grant application process, which includes the new guidelines. And then there's also a grant application cover sheet and a grant application narrative. Those are basically the same as they were before. Basically, we ask for information, a checklist, which is the cover sheet, and then also a narrative, which basically, please tell us about your organization and the people that you serve, and a little bit the makeup of your organization. And then finally, we also came up with a proposed scoring sheet in order to kind of rank the applicants. But I'd like to discuss the application process, and I've handed out a new page. It's a little more concise. There's only 2 changes. Number 1, there is not a number 7 on there anymore. That was a typo, or it was included, accidentally included as a number 7, and there's not 7 criteria. And then also the very last sentence that ran into page 2 has been changed to basically say that the funding will be determined through a combination of ranking of scores, interviews, and the committee discretion. So that's a cleanup of what you had before. And going over the application process, the criteria, there's basically 6 criteria. It's probably a little broader than the current guidelines. The current guidelines say that you must need the funding as a supplemental source in order to get matching funds from either federal or state sources, and that you must also have been approved for funding in the last 3 years. And so we're deleting that language, and we're adding criteria that says, number one, the targeted population of such services must support at least one of the following groups: the youth of the community, disabled, economically disadvantaged, or senior citizens. Number two, the applicant must provide the majority of their services to the citizens of San Benito County, or at least provide proof that the requested funding will be used for the citizens of San Benito County. Number three, the applicant must have funding sources other than the grant request. Our intention was that this is not the sole funding for that organization. Number four, the applicant must show proof of its commitment to the targeted population of San Benito County through examples of its outreach material. Basically, we just wanted to know how do people know about your services. Number five, the grant applicant must be a nonprofit, 501 organization, and the grant application must be received by the deadline specified herein.
Melinda, can I interrupt you? Melinda, can I interrupt you? On number 5, and I'm going to need help from a member of the audience, there are many different classifications of 501c, and I believe the nonprofits that are usually, okay, it is 3, okay. So usually they are 501c3.
Okay.
And I think that might need to be in there just for clarification and to keep, because I know business nonprofits, I think, are 501c6, and I don't think they would really fall into the criteria of what we want. So it might just be for clarification, we go ahead and add 501c3 into the description of number 5.
Okay. We are proposing a committee of 5 members that will include the CAO's office, a member from the auditor's office, a member from Health and Human Services, and 2 Board of Supervisors members that will review all the applications and also essentially at the end make recommendations. We are also proposing a timeline of the process. October 15th, we will notify the committee of our estimate for next year's fiscal allocation. October 30th, public notification of the start of the grant application and process. November 1st, we'll start the application process, and December 31st will be the deadline. January, we will begin reviewing the applications by the committee, and in February, we will hold interviews for any further information that is needed by the grant applicants. In March, the applicants will be notified of the results and award, and then in April, during one of our special budget meetings, we will announce those applicants for the coming fiscal year. And then at the end of the fiscal year in which you receive the grant funding, we would also request that each applicant provide a short summary of how they used the funds in the community. Again, as I said, the next 2 pages are basically the same as they were last year. A checklist to make sure that the applicant provided the information that we requested, the narrative to kind of tell us about yourself, your organization, the members that you serve, and then finally a scoring sheet based upon those applications. Any questions or comments?
Are there any questions of the board? Supervisor Patello?
Yes, first off, I really want to express my gratitude to the committee for coming up with something like this. This has been a problem, the entire time I've been on the board. You try to be as fair as you possibly can, and there's a lot of need in our community, and I think the nonprofits that have worked with the funds have done an outstanding job, stretching out the dollars that we have been able to allocate. This, I hope, adds a higher level of, fairness. But one of the questions I would have for somebody on the committee or staff, is there a balance of population we're trying to serve, and also how are we going to still determine the allocation itself to each of the agencies? Is that be through a recommendation of the, and I have no problem with that. I feel very strongly in favor of the committee makeup to bring back a recommendation to the board. But how are you going, is there a mechanism or a formula that you have in mind going forward if we go through with this process?
No, actually, there is no formula that I am aware of. I think what we were trying to do is, first of all, to make it fair and to give others an opportunity to apply, because we have not done that for several years. But, and leveraging dollars, I think that's probably one of the biggest things, that they can leverage more dollars by the help of this money from the county. So that's a good question. We really have not figured out. We have 80,000. How are we going to divvy it up?
Right.
So I think that would probably be done by the committee of 5.
Right.
But no, there is no formula at this time.
Okay.
It's just depending on the time and the applicants, how they're going to be screened out. Again, it's dependent on who submits, what are the rankings, and what time year we are. If it's a good year or bad year, then some flexibility should be allowed at the committee level, and then bring back that idea to the board level. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, one of our, in fact, Supervisor Barrios thought of a great idea is, give an increase this much, and the difference give it to an organization, which was a win-win. So hopefully, by not having the committee's handicap, some direction, it'll allow for flexibility and think of other options at the time they're making a decision.
Melinda, I just want to tell you, looking over this and my experience of working with the United Way Board and having to go through the same process, this was a great application process, great scoring, and I did a really great job on it.
Yeah, and I just want to say one more thing, that the score is not going to be the determining factor in and by itself. There will be the interviews if we feel that that's necessary, and there will also be, the committee will have some discretion, just as Supervisor De La Cruz has mentioned. So there will be 3 different considerations so that it's not just tied in to the score.
Yeah. Right. And again, Mr. Chair, at the end of the day, all these 5 board members will make the final determination.
With that, I will open it up to any member of the public that'd like to address the board on this item. We have
And I gave you, Mr. Kemp sent me an email this morning, and I handed that out to you. He had some comments regarding this process.
Good morning, Board. Clay Kemp, Executive Director of the Area Agency on Aging, run by the Seniors Council. You have my letter, and I'm not going to try to go over every point I have in there. We don't have time for that, but there are a couple things I want to highlight. And I think, first of all, I want to thank the board and staff for working on this and bringing it back here. It is a very important issue, and I think there's a lot of really positive things to say in this proposal. I love the committee makeup as just one example of that. I'm not going to focus on the good things because I want to address the concerns. I think your process could be tightened up a little bit, and that's what my letter contains, is a number of recommendations. So I would encourage you to ask it to come back in a couple weeks with those items considered for adoption. The other thing related to that I want to mention is we've been the AAA now for 30-plus years, and we fund over $400,000 of senior services to other community groups. So it always seems really odd to me that we compete with the very community groups that we fund. And if you think about our role, we're doing a quasi-government role. In most parts of the state, counties run the AAA. There's 4 AAAs that are nonprofit. We do that because it saves counties money, and I think the outcome is often better, and I think most counties would agree with that we can react faster to emerging needs affecting our older adults. So by every measure, economic and impact, this works really well to have us be the AAA. So it seems really odd that we have to apply with the agencies we fund and compete with them for funding. So I think somebody mentioned something about this recently, that we've been dating for 30 years. It's kind of time to get married. If we're going to be the AAA, I think we need to change that arrangement and not have us be a grant applicant, but make this a permanent agreement and take us out of the community program funding process and make us part of Health and Human Services or something similar where it fits better in the county. Otherwise, we're against the agencies we fund and have to compete for that every year. Every year it makes us wonder if we can continue to perform this function due to financial limitations or not. And that might not be something you want to act on today. I mean, I certainly wouldn't if I was in your shoes. But I think it's worth a discussion. And, it would be nice if we can have that, whether or not you adopt this process. But I would encourage your board and staff to engage us in looking at that option. If there's any questions about my letter, I'm happy
The
to
first question I
answer
have is you perform this role for Santa Cruz and Monterey County also, correct?
those. Santa Cruz County, yes, not Monterey
Okay,
County. There's a
so
different
what's your
order.
relationship with Santa Cruz County?
It's similar to what San Benito County has right now, which is we apply for community funding through the county. The main difference is that Santa Cruz County funds community programs at well over $3 million. So the allocation for our agency, I don't think is as much at risk. We're a very small percentage of that rather than being a third of it in this county.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Well, I'd like to ask Jim and see if what his take is on the request by Mr. Kemp regarding becoming part of the Health and Human Services Agency. Have you worked with other counties that have done that?
Well, first of all, to begin with, I was director of an area agency on aging for 10 years in Oregon, which was part of a council of governments. So there it was part of adult services, Medi-Cal, et cetera. In Contra Costa County, the area agency was part of the agency. In Santa Barbara County, it was a nonprofit. In Mariposa County, it was a multi-county kind of regional approach. My experience is they're all as successful as the work you put into them. There's an advantage to being able to coordinate within an agency on services, particularly to aged and disabled folks, and to coordinate not only services but funding. So I think the board would be well served to consider what model might work best for San Benito County. And we'd be happy to engage in that conversation.
May we direct, Mr. Chair, our director and Mr. Kemp to discuss this further and see where we can go with it and see if this is beneficial to the citizens of San Benito County?
Absolutely.
But at the same time, Mr. Chair, I think we should move forward with what's presented in front of us and let them work out.
Yeah, we're not going to, I don't think there's any attempt to hold this up.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. All right, is there anybody else that'd like to address do we have other speaker cards?
Everybody always maneuvers for the last word. Marty Richmond, I'm not trying to cut back on any of this funding, so I don't want anybody to take this the wrong way. But I think you would be well served. I think leveraging the funding is very, very important, as someone mentioned earlier. I don't know who it was. It's really vital. So you would be well-served to work very closely with the city so that the two, since 66% of the people, I understand rural economic difficulties is different than urban economic difficulties. They're different problems. But 66% of the people live in, and some of the poorest people in the county live in the city of Hollister. I would like to see you work very closely so that between the two of you, you can leverage as many organizations for other funding as possible, rather than somehow or another somebody gets all their leverage money from you and then someone else goes to the city and says, I need all my leverage money here. I think it would be worth better, and again, this is no intention of reducing the amount of money that's available. I just think it would work better if you worked very closely, and I would like to see that as part of your process to try and work with the city, and who sees the same nonprofits come for the same reasons, and it's all about funding, to try and build your packages so that you leverage as much as possible, rather than having the odd man out, whoever that is, always at the end, coming in and saying, I need that last $5,000 to leverage another $10,000, whereas someone else, you may have been able to work it out better. I understand this adds some difficulties. I don't intend it to be some big administrative monster, but I do think it's a critical portion, and I think it should be in your process. Thank you for your time.
Sorry, I didn't get here. Hi, I'm Mary Ann Hughes. I'm with the Community Food Bank, and thank you for the work on this. I'm really thrilled because I've been one of those recipients over the last few years, and it's been difficult quite knowing what to offer. And I want to echo a couple of other things. I think that the city and the county together, we serve the entire county. We serve Piscinas and Pinoche and Bitterwater and North County and everywhere. But most of our clients, frankly, live in the city of Hollister. When you have limited funds, both for the state, the city, and the county, and we have a lot of need, it makes sense to consolidate as much of the work as you can and get the best bang for your buck. So we have been, with other nonprofits, we have worked together to try to improve our services and fill gaps for each other. And the idea of the city and you guys doing that would be just really awesome, because we're going to go to the city and say the same things. We need your help too. And we happen to be one of the largest nonprofits in the county. So sometimes I feel bad about how much money we get when I know there are other services that are really struggling. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for thinking about what needs to get done. Thanks.
Okay, is there anyone else that'd like to address the board on this item? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the board. Supervisor Botello?
Yes, that was one of the problems that we had in our allocation process, is not knowing what the city was doing with some of the other organizations. And a lot of them, the organizations aren't here today. And, but I agree wholeheartedly, we should be coordinated with the city. And I just wonder if that could be a suggestion to the committees as far as reviewing the makeup, possibly having a city administrator or councilman as part of the gang that makes the recommendation to the board.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think we discussed it at intergovernmental once last year during the budget sessions.
That's right.
Mr. Supervisor De La Cruz. And at that time, I think the city had decided they were not going to fund any CBOs. And so that really left it only up to the county. But in moving forward, I think it would be good to have them at the table.
Oh, are we going to be at their table?
No, they're coming to our table.
No, but when they decide on the monies that they're going to allocate, are we going to be sitting at their table?
Well, a suggestion would be is that I think we're all on the same page as far as wanting the highest level of services to the needs that our community has, and it behooves them as well to make sure we're leveraging the money where we need to leverage, and then that would open up more ability for us to maybe meet, other organizations' revenue.
Yeah. Since we're paving the way,
Yeah.
and just as you expressed, I think it would be, we should start by inviting them, since we already have we may have our timelines that are probably a little more aggressive than theirs, and so then they can get a taste of the direction that we're taking and take it back to their council. So I think that we can start there. So invite them to our table as we move on through our timeline.
And then see how it goes this year, and then next year, maybe change the format a little different, if it's successful.
What we could do is we could bring that to the intergovernmental, this next meeting. We can kind of give a review of what we're looking at, and maybe in the middle paragraph there, it says committee of 5 members. Maybe we can add 1 or 2 more members to that, and that'll come from the city. And then just present that to them during the intergovernmental.
Well, Mr. Chair, not to be too negative here, but I just want to make sure that if we're going to do that, that the city comes to the table with money.
Well, that's the whole point, is that if they're coming with money, then we want to make sure that we leverage their money
I'll say it right now, money.
as much as we can.
Okay, I'm sorry. What I thought, we were just inviting them to help spend our money.
No.
No, really.
That's the way I was thinking it. If they're going to come with money, then they're most welcome.
Yeah. No, I think we want to take Marty and Mary Ann's comments and leveraging the funds that are out there. If the city has money to put into the pot, then we want to make sure that that money is combined with ours to leverage the CBO's ability to get more money.
Okay, what I'm hearing then, I don't think we're ready to go forward with this. Do we need to vet this out a little bit more and have it come back to us next meeting?
I would like to make a suggestion. Maybe the committee could take the letter from Clay, analyze it. Some are probably good suggestions. Some suggestions is maybe something that we don't want to do. Also evaluate whether or not, the city would like to participate on the committee and coordinate our, resources and their resources as well. They don't want a duplication and either, and then wrap this thing up and we adopt it. But I think they need to meet one more time, a little bit of work and a little bit more of a recommendation back to us.
We can do that.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why we're here today, we're here really in advance. We still have plenty of time. The budget hearings aren't till next June, so we have some time, and that was one of the reasons why I sat down with Melinda that we need to start this process, because there's, there may be some edits or some changes, some thoughts from the public as well as the board, and then it still gives us enough time to go through the process.
And we do have a meeting intergovernmental on the 2nd, so we can bring it up at that time and bring it back to this board.
Okay, so you have direction? All right.
Okay.
Then we will move on. We'll go back to item number 18. Just Espinoza?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we're on item 18 this morning still, and we have Jim Riding Sword, our Human Resources, our Health and Human Services Director, here to discuss with you authorization of a loan of $1 million for a CHISPA project, and it's coming from the Home Funds Program income for the construction of affordable housing. So, Jim?
Sure. First of all, I just would like to direct your attention to the summary on the staff report. I think that, outlines pretty much what we're requesting today. This is funding that comes out of the Home Reuse Loan Fund, which was a fund that began in California back in the 1990s. The purpose of the fund is to create housing for permanent housing for low-income people in the community. Originally, money was loaned out for low-income people in order to purchase homes. And the terms of those agreements were that they would use the money to purchase a home, and as long as they met the conditions of that purchase, the funding would not come back to the county until a title change occurred in the home. Well, over the years, that has occurred. We now have over $1 million in the Housing Reuse Fund, and we need to use it. One of the reasons we need to use it is to continue to get funding from the state for similar purposes. And as we looked at this, we had a request from CHSBA to assist with a loan of $1 million that then goes to the state for approval and then comes back to the board for final approval. And the purpose is to construct 40 units, low-income units in San Benito County, and those units would be reserved as low-income units for the next 55 years. I know that as this was going through the process with the Home Reuse Loan Committee and with the Community Action Board, there was discussion about, how is this best benefit San Benito County? Well, first of all, it creates 40 low-income units that are reserved for that purpose for the next 55 years. Secondly, it actually creates more housing opportunity than, for example, which I heard Supervisor De La Cruz say, giving $50,000 to 20 people. So this actually leverages, to some extent, the funding that you have here. There are two options in terms of payback on this loan. One option is called a residual loan option, where at the end of every year there would be an accounting of funding, and if there was any surplus funding, then it would come back to the loan. The second option is for this to be repaid at the end of 55 years with interest, 3% interest per year. In the reviews that were done, it's being recommended to the board that you consider the option of the 55-year repayment. And there are some reasons for this. One is if we start to get small amounts of money back in the Home Reuse Fund, then we have to reuse them, and because of the small amount of money, it's difficult to create programs to do that. Two is the 55-year loan gives leverage for CHSBA in terms of getting funding from other investors, from the state, from the federal government, and so forth, in order to complete this project. So after listening to the discussion on this, it seems to us that the 55-year repayment option is one that you should seriously consider. And I think that's basically it. I mean, essentially what happens is that we'll be able to create 40 units of permanent low-income housing over the next 55 years. Those units will be audited on an annual basis to be sure that they remain low income. And quite honestly, housing for people who are low income in San Benito County is a continuing problem, and this will help to begin to address that issue.
Mr. Chair,
Supervisor De La Cruz?
thank you. As part of the Home Loan Committee, there was a lot of discussion in terms of shall we go through the process of helping those families with a second down, or continue to help finance housing is a little bit loose. We should more say rental placing, because helping at this moment 40 families at one given time over 55 years, actually, it's more than just 40 families. There's a whole lot of other families. Whereas if we help them the other way in terms of the second down payment assistance, it's almost impossible for a low-income family to qualify for that $50,000. We almost have to go up to about 75,000, 100,000, and it really reduces the number of families that could really help. So the Home Loan Committee, which composed of myself and Cynthia Hohouse and Juan Cruz, and with Enrique's assistance, we all agree that this is the direction to go, is to help out Chispa with their $1 million. And there was also the questions about, shall we get some money back, a down payment? And we found out, I actually found out last week that that might actually not be a good thing, because there's also money that's going to be coming down the road that we could actually be in jeopardize of getting those funds if we don't use those little dollars when it comes to home loan programs. $5,000 is not a lot of money when it comes to housing assistance. So it was it was discussed at length. We had a lot of meetings back and forth between Home Loan Committee and Community Action Board and staff. And in fact, it was placed here on the board at the last meeting. It was pulled for a lot of other questions, and we had another meeting, and we all agree that this is probably the best package. And I really want to thank Jim. I really want to thank Ray and Chispa, Enrique. Thank you very much, and actually Supervisor Munzers too, because he had a lot of good questions that were answered at the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Barris?
Yeah, thank you. We spoke about leveraging dollars. This is going to help us, if we go in this direction, to leverage the monies that the Mental Health Services Act has provided to this county. And we'll be able to provide housing, 5 units, I believe, or 5 bedrooms.
Yes, 5 bedrooms.
To folks that have mental clients, behavioral health clients through our department.
And that's correct.
Yeah. So that, it's going to go even further by doing this, so.
Supervisor Botello?
You know, this is why you have committees working on this stuff, and I'm not, you know, I just get it like this, and I'm a little bit concerned, the fact that, I guess it's Chispa that's a service to loan, we're give them the money, and then they are, run it through their programs as far and service to loan. We won't get anything back for 55 years. What I'm worried about is that, you know, we have a few of these low-income neighborhoods already, and when we have a deed restriction placed on these houses or these properties, you have bona fide owners, but they have a hard time getting loans for home improvements because they have the low-income deed restriction. Makes it hard to qualify for a loan to replace the roof or, you know, paint the house, or, you know, 55 years is a long, long time. And I don't know why we can't talk about something like 25 years or 20 years, but we would have possibly a degradation of a neighborhood because these, you know, folks aren't able to, you know, maintain their homes or sell their homes at a market rate, and it in and itself leads to other problems.
And Supervisor Botello, I also had those concerns, but you have to remember, this is an apartment unit. This is an apartment complex. It's not individual homes.
Yeah.
And it's something, and Chispa, or their successor, would have to be maintaining the unit, and they actually have to set funds aside to maintain the unit to the federal standards. So I had some of those same concerns. I had concerns about the 55 years, the straight interest loan, so that, you know, on $1 million after 55 years, we only get $43,000 back. But as Supervisor De La Cruz said, we did have a meeting, Jim, and Chispa's representative and Ray were all there. A lot of those questions were answered, and this does seem to be the best use of this money at this time.
No,
And there are some protections built in.
Yeah. Now, to answer your other part of the question, because it's 2 questions just listening to you. The first part, I think, and I agree with our chairman about the apartment concept. The second part of the question is that actually Enrique mentioned this, and also Jose, who's in the back of in the audience, said that maybe we should consider how we help families with a second and have these restrictions. Maybe it's a share equity concept in which if a need arises where a family has a low-income home and they've been assisted, that it is not you can't wait 30 years before they can get some other financial mechanism in place. Maybe it's a certain percentage equity that if they were to refinance to rebuild their roof, that they will have to pay back to the county a certain percentage over time. So the discussions you mentioned now and the fact that the city of Hollister also had some of those restrictions, people were able to refinance their homes at a high time and they lost their homes during the downtime. We're revisiting all those concepts and all those rules to ensure that it answers your questions and it still allows for those kind of programs to move forward.
Yeah, and, I just, have a concern about the $1 million, and then we're not going to see any of it back into our program or into our hands to, continue to have a sustainable use of those funds.
There will be other funds that will be coming in that we're going to get, $500,000, $1 million that will actually come in within a year or two that can be used. If we go into an option that we will get some type of residue back, then the clock starts again, and we can't apply for state or federal home loans money again.
Mm-hmm. Why not just give them the $1 million and forget about it? 55 years, that's kind of how I off the top of my head, I would think.
We won't be here.
Yeah, we won't be here, but it just seems like a long time. I'm sorry.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. You're right.
Enrique can give you some more detail if you'd like. Sure.
Just briefly, my understanding that these type of loans are set up by the federal government as a 55-year loans. And so we really don't have an option to reduce it to 20, 25 or so years. I think in the big picture, it does bring more affordable housing projects to our low-income people, and it does satisfy our housing element as well. So I just wanted to mention that. Oh, and the other, briefly, Jaime de la Cruz is absolutely correct. As we get new home funds, if we have a balance in our home program income, we cannot have any access until program income funds are 100% spent. We did apply for $500,000, which we hope to obtain those funds, and once we do, we couldn't spend it until these are spent.
So that's my understanding. And we did a lot of discussion about this, and I think this is, a viable, good option. CHISPA is a solid partner. There are safeguards built into federal and state regulations around this, and it does put the county in the position of being able to leverage new funds as they come in.
Okay, so we still have it on our books, more or less, and that's how we leverage for the new funds.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. I think I got it clear in my mind now. Thank you.
Okay, anybody from the public like to address the board on this item?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'm Alfred Diaz-Infante, President and CEO of CHISPA. Yes, we did have an opportunity to speak with your staff and meet with Supervisor Munzer and De La Cruz to clarify how these home funds are typically structured. Mr. Ariel is correct that the federal and state government, they have a set way of establishing how these loans are set up. It is 55 years with 3% interest rate. That's what it is. The other thing, Supervisor Botelli raised a good question about, why is it 55 years and why not shorter so we can get that money back? Well, the state and federal government, they want to assure that these program income funds are being used and leveraged, and that's what we're doing. We're leveraging these funds. The total project cost is about $10.4 million. We will seek tax credits, which will raise about $6.5 million, plus a long-term loan from the Department of Agriculture. Basically, the state wants you to use it to leverage and create more affordable housing. They don't want you to hoard it. Plus, it allows you to seek additional home funds, because if you don't use it, you're not going to be eligible to pursue additional home funds. So I think the idea is to bring as much money as you can to this community, leverage it, create jobs, create affordable housing, and that's what we'd like to do. I'm available to answer more questions that you have, but again, I appreciate your staff's support and recommendation, and look forward to creating more jobs and creating more affordable housing here. Thank you.
Partnering as well.
Yes.
Like behavioral health, I think that that's a great partnership.
We're looking forward to that, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else in the public like to address the board on this item? Seeing none, bring it back to the board. What's the pleasure of the board?
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we adopt resolution authorizing a loan up to $1 million to Chispa from Home Loan Funds Program income for the consideration of affordable housing, and authorize the HNHSA director to execute a standard loan agreement on behalf of the county and any amendments therefore to and other related documents necessary as required by the State of California Housing and Community Development for the granting of the loan, and approved budget augmentation in the amount of $1 million, which require 4/5 votes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Resolution 2014-84.
Second?
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Passes 5-0.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to get the consensus of the board. We have, I think, 2 more items. I think will be fairly quick for the regular agenda. Do we have both closed item?
Yes, but the
Closed
first one
section?
will be quick.
Okay. And the CAO and myself are leaving as soon as the meeting's over for the RCRC convention. Are we able to work through?
I got my
I
wife right
know,
in front
I know
of me.
somebody has his wife in the,
In front
in
of
the
me.
audience.
She rules, and there's nothing I can say. So,
I think we should take a 2-hour lunch.
Oh, man.
No.
You're going to put us right in the middle of the Sacramento traffic. So what's the consensus of the
We
board?
could keep going as far as I'm concerned. I don't care.
Well, we got Supervisor De La Cruz with his lunch date.
you know,
Or we could take a short lunch, Mr. Chair, and come back.
at 1?
And come back at 1 and try to be done by 2.
okay, that's fair. Thank you. I appreciate